Colorado Territory, 1876. A woman stands at the edge of a dusty frontier town, clutching a worn photograph of the man she traveled 1,500 miles to marry, scanning each face that passes for the gentle eyes and kind smile she memorized during 18 months of correspondence. The telegram that reached her 3 days into her journey said only, "Come anyway, everything will be explained." And so she came, carrying hope like a fragile lantern through the wilderness. But when a stranger approaches wearing her intended face twisted into harder lines, speaking in a voice roughened by grief and guilt, she learns that some promises are kept by the living on behalf of the dead. What unfolds will test whether duty can become devotion, and whether two strangers bound by tragedy can build something real from the ashes of what might have been. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The afternoon sun beat down on Copper Falls with relentless intensity as the westbound stage from Denver rattled to a stop outside McAllister's trading post. Dust hung in the air like a copper veil, giving the small settlement an almost dreamlike quality that didn't match the harsh reality of frontier life. The town consisted of perhaps 20 buildings scattered along a single main street, with the Rocky Mountains rising like sentinels in the distance. Catherine Winters pressed her handkerchief to her lips, trying to filter the dust that seemed determined to coat everything it touched. 24 years old, with auburn hair that caught fire in the sunlight and eyes the color of creek water, she carried herself with a careful composure that masked bone-deep exhaustion. The journey from Boston had taken 3 weeks of constant travel, each mile carrying her farther from everything familiar and closer to a future she had constructed entirely from letters and hope. The stage driver, a weathered man named Garrett, who'd maintained a professional distance during the final leg of the journey, climbed down and began unloading luggage from the roof. "Copper Falls, Miss Winters, end of the line for today." Catherine smoothed the wrinkles from her traveling dress, a practical grey wool that had seemed appropriate for the frontier, but now felt suffocating in the mountain heat. Her fingers trembled slightly as she gathered her belongings, a leather satchel containing her most precious possessions, and a small trunk that held everything else she owned. "Mr. James Hartley," she said to the driver, her voice steadier than she felt. "He was to meet me here. Have you seen him?" Garrett's expression shifted, something like sympathy crossing his sun-weathered features. "Don't know any James Hartley, ma'am, but there's someone waiting." He gestured toward a figure standing in the shadow of the trading post's covered porch. Catherine's heart lurched. Even from a distance, she recognized the build, the stance, the general shape that matched the single photograph James had sent 6 months ago. Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by confusion. Why was he standing so far back? Why hadn't he come forward to greet her? She gathered her skirts and moved toward the porch, her traveling boots stirring small clouds of dust with each step. As she drew closer, details emerged that made her steps falter. The man wore rough work clothes, canvas trousers, and a shirt that had seen hard use. Nothing like the neat suit James had worn in his photograph. His face was deeply tanned, lined in ways the photograph hadn't captured, and his eyes held something dark and unreadable. "James?" Her voice came out smaller than she intended. The man removed his hat, revealing dark hair badly in need of cutting. When he spoke, his voice was rougher than she'd imagined, graveled by something that sounded like barely controlled emotion. "No, ma'am. I'm Samuel Hartley." The words hung in the air between them. Catherine felt the earth shift beneath her feet, though she remained perfectly still. "I don't understand. Where is James? The telegram said to come, that everything would be explained." Samuel's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the tanned skin. "We should talk somewhere private. There's a room at the boarding house where we can speak properly." "Tell me now." Catherine's voice hardened with an edge of steel that surprised even her. She had traveled too far, risked too much, to be put off with vague promises of later explanations. "Where is James Hartley?" Samuel looked at her for a long moment, and in his eyes Catherine saw grief so fresh and raw it made her breath catch. "My brother died 4 weeks ago. Fever took him on the trail coming back from Denver. I buried him under a cottonwood tree about 40 miles northeast of here. He paused, seemed to gather himself. I sent that telegram. I'm the one who asked you to come anyway. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Catherine reached out blindly, her hand finding the rough wooden post of the porch railing. James Hartley, the man whose letters had been her companion for 18 months, whose careful words had painted pictures of a life they would build together, was dead, had been dead for a month while she traveled westward full of hope and plans. I need to sit down. The words came from somewhere distant. Samuel moved quickly, guiding her to a bench against the trading post wall. His hand under her elbow was steady but impersonal, the touch of someone performing a necessary duty. Catherine sank onto the bench, her mind struggling to process information that seemed impossible to reconcile with the expectations she'd carried across 1,500 miles. How? The question emerged as barely a whisper. Samuel sat at the far end of the bench, maintaining careful distance. Mountain fever. We'd gone to Denver for supplies, things we'd need for... He stopped, adjusted his hat in his hands. Things for the homestead. He felt poorly on the way back. Thought it was just the altitude. By the second day, he couldn't sit a horse. I rigged a travois, tried to get him to a doctor, but the fever took him before we reached help. Catherine stared at the dusty street, watching a woman in a faded calico dress lead 2 small children past, normal life continuing while her own had just shattered into pieces she couldn't yet comprehend. Why did you ask me to come? Why not simply write and tell me what happened? Because of what he said at the end. Samuel's voice dropped, became almost reverent. James was in and out of sense those last hours, but he came clear just before the end. Made me promise something. Catherine turned to look at him fully for the first time. The resemblance to the photograph was striking and painful. This was what James would have looked like with harder years, with whatever experiences had carved those lines around his eyes and mouth. Identical twins, she realized with a shock. They must have been identical twins. What promise? Samuel met her gaze directly. He made me swear I'd honor the commitment he'd made to you. Said you'd given up everything to come west, that you deserved the life he'd promised. Made me promise I'd marry you in his place, give you the homestead, the future he'd described in his letters. He paused, said you were a good woman who deserved better than to be stranded alone in a strange place. The audacity of it struck Catherine speechless. A dying man's wish to pass her along like property to his brother. A stranger thinking he could simply substitute himself for the man she'd agreed to marry. The presumption made anger rise through her shock. I see. Her voice had gone cold. And did it occur to either of you that I might have some say in this arrangement? Something flickered in Samuel's expression that might have been approval. It occurred to me, yes. That's why I sent the telegram saying, come anyway, everything will be explained, instead of, come anyway, you're marrying me now. I figured you had a right to make your own choice with full knowledge of the situation. Catherine stood, needing movement to process the roiling emotions threatening to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. She walked to the edge of the porch, looking out at the small frontier town that was supposed to have been her new home, Copper Falls. James had written about it in his letters, describing a growing community with good people and real potential. He'd made it sound almost civilized, a place where an educated Eastern woman could build a meaningful life. Tell me about the homestead. Samuel rose, moving to stand a respectful distance away. 160 acres, about 6 miles south of town. Good water from a spring-fed creek. Meadowland for crops and grazing. Timber on the slopes. James filed the claim 2 years ago. Built a cabin. Started clearing land. It's basic, but solid. And what do you do, Mr. Hartley? Samuel, he corrected quietly. I run a sawmill 3 miles west of the homestead. Been here 4 years, building up the business. Copper Falls is growing, needs lumber. I do well enough. Catherine absorbed this information, her mind beginning to work past the emotional shock toward practical considerations. She had exactly $17 remaining from the money she'd saved for the journey. Her return ticket funds had been spent, when unexpected delays added extra stage costs. Going back to Boston meant returning to her aunt's house, to the suffocating expectations of a woman who'd made clear that Catherine's only value was in making an advantageous marriage. At 24, and without family wealth, her prospects there were grim. "Why would you agree to such a promise?" she asked, turning to face Samuel. "You don't know me. Your brother's dying wish aside, why would you bind yourself to a complete stranger?" Samuel was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. James was the better man. Kinder, gentler, more suited to building a life with someone. "I'm rougher around the edges, been on my own too long to be easy company." He looked at her directly. "But he was my twin brother, the only family I had left. When a man makes a deathbed promise, he keeps it. That's all there is to it." The stark simplicity of the statement carried more weight than elaborate explanations would have. Catherine recognized the same quality she'd valued in James's letters: directness without pretense, honesty even when it was uncomfortable. "I appreciate your candor, Mr. Hartley, Samuel, but I need time to think. This is not at all what I expected, and I can't make such a significant decision while still in shock." "Understood." Samuel gestured down the street. "Martha Brennan runs a boarding house 2 buildings down. Clean rooms, fair prices. I'll arrange for your trunk to be delivered and cover the cost of lodging while you consider your options." He paused. "The eastbound stage comes through on Thursdays. That's 4 days from now. Whatever you decide, I'll respect it." The offer was more generous than Catherine had any right to expect from a stranger, even one bound by a deathbed promise. "That's very kind, but I can pay for my own lodging." "I'm sure you can." Samuel's tone was neutral. "But James would have met you with lodging arranged. I'm trying to honor what he would have done." Catherine wanted to argue, but exhaustion was finally overwhelming the adrenaline that had sustained her through the shock. She nodded once, accepting the offer. "Thank you. I'll let you know my decision before Thursday." Samuel replaced his hat, the gesture somehow formal despite his rough appearance. "I'll stop by tomorrow afternoon to answer any questions you might have about the homestead or the area. You should know what you're choosing, one way or another." He turned to leave, then paused. From inside his shirt, he withdrew a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "James's personal effects, his watch, the letters you sent him, a few other things. I thought you should have them." Catherine accepted the bundle with trembling hands. The weight of it seemed to carry more than physical objects. It held the ghost of all the plans and hopes that had brought her to this moment. "There's one more thing you should know," Samuel said, his voice rough. "Reading your letters was the only time I ever saw James truly happy in the 4 years since we came west. Whatever you decide about staying or going, know that you gave him something real and good in his last months. That matters." He walked away before Catherine could respond, his boots striking the wooden boardwalk with solid, even steps. She watched him go, this stranger wearing her intended face, carrying her intended burden of promise like a yoke he'd taken on without question. Martha Brennan's boarding house proved to be exactly as advertised: clean, simple, and efficiently run by a woman whose sharp eyes seemed to miss nothing but whose mouth asked no invasive questions. Catherine's room was small but adequate, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the main street. The trunk Samuel had arranged to have delivered sat at the foot of the bed. Once alone, Catherine finally allowed herself to fully feel the weight of what had happened. She sank onto the bed, still clutching the oilcloth bundle, and let the carefully maintained composure crack. Tears came in waves. For James Hartley, a man she'd never met but had built a future around. For the life she'd left behind that now seemed impossible to reclaim. For the overwhelming uncertainty of her current situation. When the storm of grief finally passed, Catherine washed her face at the basin and sat down to examine the bundle Samuel had given her. Inside, she found a silver pocket watch engraved with the initials J.H., a small leather journal, and a packet of letters tied with string, her own letters written over 18 months of careful correspondence. The journal drew her attention. Opening it carefully, Catherine found entries in a neat, careful hand. James had documented his daily life: clearing land, building the cabin, planting crops, planning for a future that included a wife from Boston. The entries were matter-of-fact but carried an underlying tone of quiet optimism. One entry from 3 months ago caught her attention. Received another letter from Catherine today. She writes about the spring flowers in the public garden, describes them with such precision I can almost see them. She has an artist's eye for detail. I find myself reading her letters multiple times, discovering something new with each reading. Samuel says I'm acting like a lovesick fool. Maybe he's right. I don't mind. Catherine's throat tightened. This was a man she could have built a life with, someone who valued her observations, who found joy in her words. The loss hit her again, fresh and sharp. Further into the journal, she found entries about Samuel. Sam's been working himself to exhaustion at the mill. He won't admit it, but I think he's been setting aside extra profits to help with building the addition to the cabin. Says Catherine will need a proper kitchen and a room for sewing or whatever ladies do. He pretends not to care, but he remembers every detail I mention from her letters. Catherine sat back, absorbing this new information. Samuel Hartley had been preparing for her arrival alongside his brother, investing his own resources into making the homestead suitable for a woman he'd never met. The gesture suggested a capacity for loyalty and generosity that contradicted his self-description as rough and unsuitable for partnership. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Martha Brennan stood in the hallway, carrying a tray with bread, cheese, and hot tea. Thought you might appreciate something simple after your journey? No charge. Samuel Hartley settled your account, including meals. That's very generous, Mrs. Brennan. Thank you. The older woman hesitated, then spoke carefully. I knew James Hartley. Good man, always polite, always fair in his dealings. This town's worse off for losing him. She paused. Samuel's cut from different cloth, but he's solid. If you're considering staying, you could do worse than honoring whatever arrangement brought you here. Catherine appreciated the directness. You know why I came? Small town, Miss Winters. Word travels, and Samuel was pretty torn up when James died. Whole town knew they'd lost something good. Martha set down the tray. I'll leave you to your rest. If you need anything, just ask. After the landlady departed, Catherine ate mechanically, her mind working through options and obstacles. Returning to Boston meant admitting failure, meant subjecting herself again to her aunt's criticism and the limited prospects available to unmarried women without means. Staying meant marrying a complete stranger based on his dead brother's promise, an arrangement so unconventional it bordered on absurd. Yet there was something compelling about Samuel Hartley's straightforward approach. He hadn't tried to romance her or pretend the situation was anything other than what it was, a duty he'd accepted and would fulfill if she chose to allow it. There was a certain honesty in that she found she respected. Catherine moved to the window, looking out at Copper Falls as evening shadows lengthened across the dusty street. The mountains in the distance glowed purple and gold in the fading light, beautiful and alien compared to Boston's familiar landscapes. This was the place James had chosen to build a future. These were the vistas he'd tried to describe in his letters, though his words had fallen short of reality. Somewhere out there, 6 miles south, sat a cabin built by a man whose dreams had died with him, and 3 miles beyond that, a sawmill run by a man trying to honor his brother's last wish. The whole situation felt impossibly complicated, and yet starkly simple at the same time. Catherine opened her satchel and withdrew writing materials. She needed to organize her thoughts, to think through this decision with the same careful consideration she'd applied to every major choice in her life. But as she sat with pen poised over paper, she found herself uncertain even where to begin. The fundamental question was simple enough. Could she build a life with Samuel Hartley, based on nothing more than his brother's dying wish and her own desperate need for a future different from the one waiting in Boston? But the answer depended on variables she couldn't yet calculate, on understanding more about the man, the place, and the life being offered. Tomorrow, Samuel had said he would come to answer questions. Catherine began began making a list, practical considerations that would help her understand what she was truly choosing between. What were the terms of the homestead claim? What would be expected of her in terms of work and contribution? What was Samuel's true character beyond the gruff exterior he presented? Could she trust a man she'd just met with her entire future? As darkness fell over Copper Falls, Catherine lit the lamp and continued writing, organizing her thoughts into categories and questions. The process calmed her, gave her something concrete to focus on beyond the emotional turmoil. By the time she finally set down the pen, she had 3 pages of careful notes and a slightly clearer sense of what she needed to know before making her decision. Outside her window, the town settled into nighttime quiet. Somewhere in that darkness, Samuel Hartley was presumably dealing with his own grief and the weight of a promise that had brought a stranger into his life. Catherine wondered what he thought of the situation, whether he resented the obligation or accepted it as simply one more duty in a life that seemed defined by hard work and responsibility. Sleep came fitfully, disturbed by dreams of a man with kind eyes who existed only in a photograph and letters, and another man with the same face hardened by circumstances she didn't yet understand. When dawn light filtered through her window, Catherine woke with no more certainty than she'd had the night before, but with a resolve to approach the day methodically, gathering information before making any irreversible choices. The future hung in balance, poised between the known disappointments of the past and the uncertain possibilities of what lay ahead. Samuel Hartley arrived at the boarding house precisely when he'd promised, 3 o'clock on an afternoon that had turned unexpectedly cool with clouds gathering over the mountains. Catherine watched from her window as he tied his horse to the rail. Outside, noting the careful way he checked the knot twice, the methodical movements that suggested a man who did everything with deliberate attention, she met him in the boarding house parlor, a modest room where Martha Brennan received guests. The landlady had tactfully made herself scarce, though Catherine suspected the woman was within earshot in the adjacent kitchen. "Miss Winters." Samuel removed his hat, revealing that he'd made some effort to tame his dark hair. He wore cleaner clothes than yesterday, though still rough work garments rather than anything formal. "I hope you rested well as could be expected given the circumstances." Catherine gestured to the worn sofa. "Please, sit. I have questions. Quite a few of them, actually." Samuel sat with the rigid posture of a man unaccustomed to parlor furniture. Catherine took the chair opposite, her notebook open on her lap. She'd dressed carefully in a simple blue day dress, wanting to appear composed and businesslike rather than grief-stricken or desperate. "I've made a list," she began, consulting her notes. "First, I need to understand the legal status of the homestead. James wrote that he'd filed a claim, but what are the requirements for maintaining it?" Samuel nodded, apparently approving of her practical approach. "Federal homestead law requires 5 years of continuous residence and improvement of the land. James was in his 3rd year. To keep the claim, someone has to continue living there and working the property. If it sits abandoned for more than 6 months, the claim can be challenged. And if I return to Boston, what would happen to it? I'd move onto the property myself, maintain it until the 5 years are complete. It would be mine instead of passing to you." He met her eyes directly. "I'm being honest about that. I don't need the land. My sawmill provides well enough, but I won't let James's work go to waste." Catherine appreciated the candor. "What exactly did James build there? His letters describe the cabin, but I'd like details." "Single-room structure, 16 by 20 feet, solid log construction with a stone fireplace. James added a sleeping loft last year. There's a root cellar dug into the hillside for food storage, a chicken coop that needs some repair, and a small barn for livestock. He'd cleared about 10 acres for planting, had another 5 partially cleared." Samuel paused. "It's basic, Miss Winters. No luxuries, but it's sound and weather-tight. Water source? Spring-fed creek runs through the southeast corner of the property. Never goes dry even in late summer. James diverted part of it for irrigation." Catherine made notes, building a mental picture of the place. "And the land itself? Is it fertile? What grows there?" "James planted wheat, corn, and vegetables last season. Good yields on all of it. The soil's rich where the creek floods in spring. Higher ground is better for grazing. He had plans to run cattle eventually." Samuel shifted slightly. "The location is decent too. Close enough to town for commerce, far enough for privacy. Good timber on the upper slopes that could be harvested selectively for income. You've clearly thought about the property's potential. James and I talked about it often. We planned together. Even though it was his claim, something crossed Samuel's expression, quickly suppressed. He had vision for what it could become. I helped where I could. Catherine studied him carefully. Why didn't you file your own claim instead of helping with his? I did, initially. Land adjacent to his. But running the sawmill takes all my time. Can't maintain a homestead claim and operate the business both. I let my claim lapse, focused on the mill. He shrugged. Figured James's family would eventually be my family too. Didn't see much point in holding separate property. The statement carried implications Catherine wasn't ready to examine. She returned to her questions. What would be expected of me if I stayed? I should be clear that I have no experience with frontier farming. Neither did James when he started. Learning is part of it. Samuel leaned forward slightly, his manner becoming more animated. The basics aren't complicated. Chickens need feeding and collecting eggs. Garden needs tending, preserving food for winter. General maintenance of the buildings and equipment. Nothing that can't be learned with time and attention. And the heavier work, plowing, harvesting, repairs that require significant strength, I'd handle that, same as I helps James. The mill keeps me busy, but I can spare time for the homestead. Neighbors help each other out here too. That's how frontier communities survive. He paused. You wouldn't be alone in it, is what I'm saying. Catherine set down her pen, meeting his gaze directly. Let me be frank, Samuel. What you're proposing is essentially a business arrangement dressed up as marriage. I need to understand what that means practically. Would you expect a real marriage, or simply a legal arrangement to maintain the property? Color rose in Samuel's weathered face, but he didn't look away. That would be your choice entirely. My promise to James was to give you the life he'd offered, a home, security, partnership in building something worthwhile. How we define that partnership would be up to you. I won't force anything beyond what you're willing to give. That's a significant concession for a man to make. Maybe, Samuel's jaw tightened, but I won't dishonor my brother's memory by treating you as anything less than he would have. James respected you, so will I. The conviction in his voice carried a weight that Catherine found unexpectedly moving. She consulted her notes again, needing to maintain emotional distance. Tell me about Copper Falls. What kind of community is it? Samuel seemed relieved by the shift to safer territory. About 200 people in town, maybe twice that in the surrounding area. We've got a general store, blacksmith, doctor, church that doubles as a school. Most folks are decent, willing to help neighbors. Some are rougher sorts, drawn by mining prospects in the hills, but Sheriff Collins keeps order well enough. Are there other women? Families? Quite a few. The Brennans have 3 daughters. Doc Morrison's wife teaches school. Several ranching families have settled in the valley. He counted on his fingers. I'd say maybe 40 women total, various ages. You wouldn't be isolated from female company if that concerns you. It did concern her, though Catherine hadn't fully acknowledged it until now. The thought of being the only woman for miles had lurked in the back of her mind as one more anxiety about frontier life. What do people know about my situation? James sent for a bride and died before she arrived, that I'm trying to honor his commitment. Samuel's expression turned wry. Small towns talk, Miss Winters. There's been speculation about whether you'd come, what you'd do when you learn the truth. Some folks think I'm noble for keeping my promise. Others think I'm a fool. Most are just curious. How do you think they'd react if I agreed to stay? Mixed, probably. Some would approve of honoring James's wishes. Others would find it irregular. He shrugged. But frontier towns are used to irregular. People tend to judge by results rather than methods. If we make the homestead work, build a decent life, most folks will accept it. Catherine absorbed this, imagining herself as the subject of town gossip and speculation. It wasn't a comfortable thought, but then nothing about her current situation was comfortable. I'd like to see the homestead before making my final decision. Would that be possible? Samuel's expression brightened slightly. Of course, I can take you there tomorrow if you'd like. It's a few hours' ride, or we could take a wagon if you prefer. Wagon would be better. I'm not an experienced rider. I'll bring the wagon at 8, if that suits you. Pack whatever you'd need for the day. We'll be gone until evening. He stood, clearly considering the conversation concluded. Any other questions for now? Catherine rose as well, one more question pressing forward. Why are you really doing this, Samuel? And don't tell me it's just about a deathbed promise. There has to be more to it. He was silent for a long moment, turning his hat in his hands. When he spoke, his voice carried a raw honesty that stripped away the careful politeness. James was everything good that I'm not. Patient, kind, able to see the best in people. We came west together after our parents died. Planned to build something worthwhile out here, but I got caught up in making the sawmill profitable. Let him do the harder work of homesteading alone. Samuel's hands tightened on the hat brim. When he was dying, he wasn't worried about himself. He was worried about you, about breaking a promise to someone who'd trusted him. That's who he was. So, yes, I made the promise because he asked, but I'm keeping it because he deserved better from me while he was alive, and this is the only way I can make that right. The confession hung in the air between them. Catherine saw the genuine grief and guilt etched in every line of Samuel's face, and something in her chest tightened with unexpected sympathy. Thank you for your honesty. He nodded once and left without further words, leaving Catherine alone with her thoughts and the weight of a decision that felt increasingly complex with every new piece of information. That evening, Catherine joined Martha Brennan and her daughters for supper in the boarding house dining room. The meal was simple but well prepared, and the conversation gave Catherine her first real taste of what life in Copper Falls might be like. The three Brennan daughters, Rose, Violet, and Daisy, aged 18, 15, and 12, respectively, were openly curious about the stranger in their midst. Rose, the eldest, showed the most tact in her questions. Did you really come all the way from Boston, Miss Winters? What's it like there? Catherine described the city carefully, noting how the girl's eyes widened at descriptions of gaslighting, paved streets, and shops filled with goods from around the world. Their wonder reminded her how far she'd traveled, not just in miles, but in stepping into an entirely different world. Do you think you'll stay? Violet asked, weakness of youth. Everyone's wondering if you'll marry Samuel Hartley. Violet! Martha's reproach was swift. Mind your manners. It's all right, Catherine said. It's a fair question, though I haven't decided yet. I'm going to see the homestead tomorrow before making my choice. Samuel's a good man, Martha offered, passing the bread. Quiet, keeps to himself mostly, but he's fair in his business dealings, and he's helped folks when they needed it. After the Henderson fire last year, he donated lumber for rebuilding their barn, didn't ask for payment. He's not much for socializing, though, Rose added. Comes to town for supplies and business, but doesn't linger for the social gatherings, not like James did. The comparison was inevitable, Catherine realized. In this small community, the differences between the twin brothers would have been noticeable and remarked upon. Did you know James well? Everyone knew James, Daisy piped up. He was nice, always had peppermints in his pocket for kids. And he helped Papa fix our wagon wheel once. Wouldn't take any money for it. Catherine felt the loss afresh, hearing about the man she'd never meet from people who'd known his kindness firsthand. James Hartley had clearly been woven into the fabric of this community in ways his brother was not. After supper, Rose approached Catherine privately. Miss Winters, I hope you don't think I'm being forward, but I wanted to say something. Samuel Hartley might seem rough compared to what you're used to, but he's genuine. What you see is what you get with him. That's worth something out here, where some men present one face and live another. Thank you, Rose. I'll keep that in mind. That night, Catherine laid out practical clothing for the next day's journey to the homestead. She felt oddly nervous about seeing the place James had built, the physical manifestation of all the plans they'd made through letters. It would make everything more real, force her to confront the actual choice rather than the abstract concept of it. Sleep came easier than the night before, though her dreams were filled with images of log cabins and mountain vistas she'd never seen. Samuel arrived exactly at 8, driving a sturdy wagon pulled by 2 draft horses. He'd packed supplies in the back, water, food for lunch, tools whose purpose Catherine couldn't identify. His efficiency suggested he'd made this journey many times. Morning, he greeted her. Weather should hold. Good day for a ride. Catherine climbed onto the wagon seat with less grace than she'd have liked, her city upbringing not having prepared her for the height of farm wagons. Samuel made no comment on her awkwardness, simply waited until she was settled before releasing the brake. They left Copper Falls heading south, following a track that was barely more than wheel ruts through grassland. The morning was cool and fresh, the air so clear Catherine felt she could see forever. Mountains rose on all sides, their peaks still holding snow despite the advancing season. For the first hour, they rode in silence. Catherine studied the landscape, trying to imagine herself as part of it rather than a visitor passing through. The vastness was intimidating, but also strangely exhilarating. There was a freedom in all that open space that Boston's crowded streets had never offered. "James used to say the sky is bigger out here," Samuel said suddenly, breaking the silence. Said it made him feel like anything was possible. Did you feel the same? Sometimes. Other times it just made me feel small. He guided the horses around a rocky outcrop. James was the optimist. I'm more practical, I guess. See the obstacles before the possibilities. That's not necessarily a bad quality. Optimism without practicality can lead to disaster. Samuel glanced at her, something like surprise in his expression. That's fair. James had both, actually. Dreamed big, but worked hard to make the dreams real. I respected that about him. They passed through a grove of aspens, their leaves shimmering silver-green in the breeze. A deer watched them from the shadows, motionless until they'd passed, then bounding away with fluid grace. Catherine had never seen a wild deer before, and the sight filled her with unexpected wonder. "There's the boundary marker," Samuel pointed to a cairn of stones at the base of a distinctive rock formation. "James's land starts here." The track became rougher as they entered the property, following the curve of a creek that burbled over smooth stones. Catherine could see why James had chosen this location. The water, the shelter of the surrounding hills, the meadow opening ahead with its carpet of wildflowers and grasses. And there, nestled against the slope of a hill with timber rising behind it, stood the cabin that was supposed to have been her home. The cabin was smaller than Catherine had imagined, but more substantial than she'd feared. Solid logs fitted together with careful craftsmanship. A stone chimney rising from the center, 2 glass windows catching the morning light. A covered porch stretched across the front, offering shelter from weather. Behind it, the hillside rose in a gentle slope covered with pine and aspen, while before it the meadow spread like a green and gold blanket toward the creek. Samuel brought the wagon to a stop in front of the cabin and set the brake. He sat quietly for a moment, his gaze on the building, and Catherine saw grief flicker across his features before he masked it with deliberate movement. "This is it," he said simply, climbing down and coming around to help her descend. Catherine accepted his hand, noting the calluses and the careful strength in his grip. Once on the ground, she stood taking in the full scope of what James had built. The barn stood 30 yards to the left, smaller than the cabin but well constructed. The chicken coop needed repair, as Samuel had mentioned, one side listing badly. Cleared fields stretched beyond, raw stumps marking where trees had been removed, the earth already showing the green of new plantings. "Can we go inside?" Samuel produced a key from his pocket, a simple iron thing that looked handmade. "I've been coming by weekly to check on things, keep the place aired out. Haven't changed anything of James's." The interior was dim until Samuel opened the shutters, flooding the single room with light. Catherine stepped across the threshold and stopped, taking in the space that James Hartley had prepared for a wife he would never bring home. The cabin was organized with bachelor efficiency, but showed touches that revealed James's anticipation of her arrival. A rocking chair sat near the fireplace, clearly new, its wood still pale and unweathered. Shelves lined one wall, already stocked with dishes, cooking implements, and supplies. A table with 2 chairs occupied the center of the room. Against the far wall stood a bed frame, empty of mattress but solidly built, and beside it a chest of drawers with a small mirror mounted above. "James made the rocking chair himself," Samuel said quietly. "Worked on it in the evenings at my place. Said every proper home needed one for when there were children to rock." The detail pierced Catherine's composure. She moved to the chair, running her hand along the smooth armrest, imagining James bent over his work, planning for a future that would never arrive. "The loft?" She pointed to the ladder leading upward. "Storage mostly, though it could be a Sleeping space. James thought eventually it might be for children, once you'd added proper rooms to the cabin. Samuel gestured to the rear wall. He had plans drawn up for an addition, parlor and 2 bedrooms. I still have the sketches if you want to see them. Catherine climbed the ladder to examine the loft. It was cramped but serviceable, the roof close overhead. Through the small window cut into the gable, she could see the sweep of the valley and the mountains beyond. The view was breathtaking, and she understood why James had positioned that window precisely there. Descending, she explored the rest of the space more thoroughly. The fireplace was beautifully constructed, with a crane for hanging pots and an oven built into the stonework. The root cellar door was set into the floor near the back wall. Everything showed careful planning and skilled execution. Did James build all of this himself? Most of it. I helped with the heavy logs and the roof framing. That takes multiple hands. But the finish work, the details, that was all James. Samuel leaned against the doorframe, watching her exploration. He was good with his hands, patient with the work, better craftsman than I am. Catherine moved to the window, overlooking the creek. From here she could see the water flowing clear over smooth stones, willows growing along the banks, dragonflies darting in the sunlight. It was utterly different from anything she'd known in Boston, and yet something in her responded to the simple beauty of it. "What's the property line?" she asked. Samuel joined her at the window, pointing. "Creek forms the southern boundary. Eastern line runs along that ridge you can see there. Western boundary is marked by stakes about a quarter mile that direction. North goes to the base of that timbered slope. 160 acres total, like I said. It's larger than I can properly visualize. Most of a square mile, roughly. Enough for a good homestead, small herd of cattle, diverse crops. James was planning to add an orchard on that eastern slope. The exposure is right for fruit trees." Samuel paused. He'd ordered saplings from Denver. They arrived 2 weeks after he died. I planted them anyway, figured they shouldn't go to waste. Catherine turned to look at him. "You've been maintaining all of this? The planting, the property upkeep while running your sawmill. It's what neighbors do. And like I said, this was James's dream. Couldn't let it die with him." Samuel's expression was unreadable. "Besides, I made a promise to him before he ever got sick. Told him I'd always have his back, same as when we were boys. This is just keeping that older promise." The devotion was undeniable, and Catherine found herself revising her initial impression of Samuel Hartley as merely duty-bound. This was something deeper, a love for his brother that extended beyond death into preservation of everything James had worked to build. "Show me the rest of the property," she said decisively. They spent the next 3 hours touring the homestead. Samuel showed her the irrigation channels James had dug, the vegetable garden already showing promising growth of potatoes and beans, the small herd of chickens scratching in the yard despite their dilapidated coop. He pointed out the best grazing areas, the stands of timber that could be selectively harvested, the protected hollow where James had planned to build a proper barn. Catherine asked questions constantly, trying to understand not just what existed but what was possible. Samuel answered with increasing animation, clearly knowledgeable about land management and development. She began to see how the brothers must have worked together. James's vision combined with Samuel's practical expertise, creating something neither could have achieved alone. They stopped for lunch beside the creek, sitting on smooth rocks while the water burbled past. Samuel unpacked bread, cheese and apples from the supplies he'd brought. They ate in companionable silence, and Catherine realized the quiet between them had become comfortable rather than awkward. "I need to know something," she said finally. "If I agree to this arrangement, what would our partnership actually look like day to day? You have the sawmill 3 miles away. Would you live there or here?" Samuel considered the question carefully. "Haven't worked that out entirely. The practical answer is I'd need to be at the mill during work hours. I've got contracts to fulfill, timber to process, but evenings and Sundays I could be here handling the heavier work, helping establish routines." He paused. "Eventually we'd need to decide on something more permanent. Either I hire someone to run the mill while I focus on the homestead, or we find reliable help for the homestead while I continue the mill work. Both have advantages. Which would you prefer?" "Honestly, I'd prefer to keep the mill. It's what I'm good at, what I've built. But I'd give it up if that's what the homestead needed. He met her eyes. The promise I made was to give you the life James offered. That comes first. Catherine appreciated the candor. What if we approached it differently? What if I learned to manage the homestead's daily operations while you continued the mill work? You'd still be available for tasks requiring greater strength or expertise, but I'd handle the routine maintenance. Samuel's eyebrows rose. That's more responsibility than most would want to take on, especially someone from a city background. I'm capable of learning, and I prefer a useful occupation to idle gentility. Catherine surprised herself with the firmness in her voice. If I'm going to be here, I want to contribute meaningfully, not simply be a decorative presence waiting for someone else to do the real work. A slow smile transformed Samuel's face, making him look younger and less careworn. James said you were independent-minded. He appreciated that about you. Did he? Some detail warmed her. What else did he say? Samuel looked away, suddenly awkward. That your letters showed intelligence and curiosity, that you asked questions about the land and the work instead of just writing about fashions and social calls, that you seemed like someone who wanted a real partnership, not just security. He cleared his throat. He was excited about that, said too many arrangements were just transactions, but he thought you and he could build something genuine. The loss struck Catherine again. She and James might actually have suited each other well, but dwelling on what might have been served no purpose. The question was what could be, here and now, with the resources and circumstances available. I want to see the sawmill, she said abruptly. If we're discussing partnership, I should understand all the elements involved. Samuel looked surprised but nodded agreement. It's on the way back to town. We can stop there. They packed up the lunch remains and returned to the wagon. As they drove away from the cabin, Catherine looked back at the small homestead nestled against the hillside. She tried to imagine herself there, waking to mountain air and birdsong, spending days in productive labor, building something tangible with her own hands. The vision was both appealing and terrifying. The sawmill operation was larger and more complex than Catherine had anticipated. The main building housed the saw apparatus, powered by a water wheel turned by a diverted stream. Stacks of cut lumber in various stages of drying filled a large yard. A smaller building served as Samuel's workshop and office, while a simple cabin behind it was clearly his living quarters. Two men were working the mill when they arrived, feeding logs into the saw while another stacked the resulting planks. Samuel introduced them as Henry Chen and his son Thomas, both skilled workers who'd been with him since the mill's early days. Miss Winters is considering the Hartley homestead, Samuel explained without elaborating on the marriage arrangement. Wanted to see the operation here. Henry Chen, a compact man with graying hair and intelligent eyes, nodded politely. Good to meet you, miss. James spoke of you often. We were all sorry for the loss. His son Thomas, perhaps 20, ducked his head shyly but offered a gap-toothed smile. Catherine noticed he communicated primarily through gestures and realized the young man was deaf. Thomas reads lips well, Henry explained, catching her observation. And he's the best sawyer I've ever seen. Feels the wood in ways hearing folks can't. Samuel walked Catherine through the operation, explaining the process from raw timber to finished lumber. His knowledge was comprehensive, his pride in the operation evident, though he downplayed his own role. The Chen men clearly respected him, and their easy cooperation suggested a good working relationship. In the office, Catherine examined the ledgers Samuel maintained. The books were meticulous, every transaction recorded in neat columns. The sawmill was clearly profitable, with steady orders from Copper Falls and surrounding communities. You've built a substantial business, she observed. It fills a need. Copper Falls is growing. People need lumber. I'm positioned well to supply it. Samuel closed the ledger. It's not a fortune, but it provides steady income and room for expansion as the territory develops. Catherine understood the implications. If she married Samuel, she'd be partnering with a man of some means and business acumen, not just taking on a struggling homestead. The combination of the sawmill income and the homestead's potential created a foundation more stable than she'd realized. We should head back, Samuel said, noting the son's position. Don't want you caught out after dark. The return journey gave Catherine time to process everything she'd seen. The homestead was real, tangible, full of potential, but requiring significant work. Samuel's sawmill operation was professional and profitable. The combination suggested a life that could be comfortable by frontier standards, though nothing like the ease she'd known in Boston. As they approached Copper Falls, Samuel spoke quietly. "I know this is a lot to take in. If you need more time beyond Thursday's stage, I'll arrange it. No pressure, no obligation." Catherine had been thinking precisely about that. "I appreciate the offer, but delaying won't change the fundamental decision. I either believe this partnership could work, or I don't. Another week won't provide clarity that the next 2 days can't." "Fair enough." Samuel guided the wagon onto the main street. "For what it's worth, I think you do well here. You've got the kind of mind that finds solutions instead of just seeing problems. That's what frontier life requires." The compliment was unexpected and oddly touching. "Thank you. That means something coming from you." Samuel pulled the wagon to a stop outside the boarding house. Before Catherine could climb down, a man emerged from the general store across the street and strode purposefully toward them. He was perhaps 40, well-dressed by frontier standards, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Hartley," the man said, his tone carrying an edge. "Heard you've been spending considerable time away from your mill lately. Hope that doesn't mean you'll be late on the Garrison timber order." Samuel's expression cooled. "Never missed a deadline yet, Garrison? Won't start now." Garrison's gaze shifted to Catherine, assessing her with unconcealed interest. "And who might this be? I don't believe we've met, miss." "Catherine Winters," she replied carefully, not liking the calculating look in the man's eyes. "Ah, the intended bride from Boston. Terrible tragedy about James." Garrison's sympathy sounded practiced rather than genuine. "Must be quite a shock finding yourself stranded out here." "Miss Winters isn't stranded," Samuel said firmly. "She has options." Of course, Garrison smiled without warmth. "Though I imagine those options are rather limited for a woman alone so far from home. If you find yourself in need of employment or assistance, Miss Winters, I own several businesses in Copper Falls, always willing to help a lady in unfortunate circumstances." The offer carried implications that made Catherine's skin crawl. "That's very kind, but unnecessary. I'm quite capable of managing my own affairs." "Independent spirit, admirable." Garrison's smile widened. "Still, the offer stands. Frontier life can be harsh for those unprepared for it. Better to have friends in positions to help." Samuel stepped down from the wagon, positioning himself subtly between Catherine and Garrison. "Miss Winters has friends. She'll be fine. Now if you'll excuse us, we've had a long day." Garrison's expression hardened momentarily before he recovered his smooth demeanor. "Of course. Good evening to you both." He tipped his hat and walked away, but not before Catherine caught a look that suggested this conversation wasn't finished. "Who is he?" she asked once Garrison was out of earshot. "Robert Garrison owns the largest general store, the freight company, and has interest in several other businesses around town. Considers himself Copper Falls's leading citizen." Samuel's tone was neutral, but his jaw was tight. "He's been trying to acquire timber rights on land adjacent to the homestead. James refused to sell. Garrison wasn't pleased. Do you think he'll cause problems?" "He might try. Garrison doesn't like being thwarted." Samuel helped Catherine down from the wagon. "But that's not your concern unless you decide to stay. And even then, standing up to men like Garrison is something I'm well practiced at." Catherine filed the information away, adding it to the growing list of factors to consider. A powerful man with interest in the homestead property could complicate things significantly. That evening, Catherine sat in her room writing a letter she might never send, addressed to her aunt in Boston. She described the journey, the situation she'd found, the choice she faced. Writing it helped clarify her thoughts, even knowing she'd likely tear it up rather than post it. The fundamental question remained simple. Could she build a life with Samuel Hartley based on his brother's dying wish and her own need for a future? But the answer had become more complex with each piece of new information. The homestead was viable but demanding. Samuel was honorable but emotionally distant. The community was welcoming but came with complications like Robert Garrison. And beneath it all lay the ghost of James Hartley, the man she'd agreed to marry, whose shadow would inevitably linger over any life she built here. Catherine set down her pen and moved to the window. Copper Falls was settling into evening quiet, lamps being lit in windows, people finishing their daily work. This could be her community, These could be her neighbors. That cabin in the valley could be her home. The life wouldn't be easy, but it would be purposeful, built on honest work rather than social pretense. And Samuel Hartley, for all his gruff edges, had shown himself to be a man of genuine integrity. He'd made no false promises, offered no romantic illusions. What he'd offered was partnership, respect, and the freedom to define the terms of their arrangement. That was more than many women received in far more conventional situations. Tomorrow was Wednesday. The eastbound stage left Thursday afternoon. Catherine needed to make her decision, and she was beginning to understand what that decision would be. Wednesday morning arrived with unexpected rain, a steady downpour that turned Copper Falls's main street into a ribbon of mud and kept most residents indoors. Catherine stood at her window watching the water stream from the boarding house eaves, postponing the conversation she knew needed to happen today. She'd made her decision sometime in the hours before dawn, lying awake while the first raindrops pattered against the glass. The choice felt both inevitable and terrifying, but she'd reached the conclusion that going forward into uncertainty held more promise than retreating to the known disappointments waiting in Boston. Now she simply needed to tell Samuel. He arrived mid-morning, soaked despite his oilskin coat, hat dripping water onto Martha Brennan's clean floor. The landlady took one look at him and pointed toward the kitchen. "Get yourself dried off and warmed up before you track mud through my entire house. Coffee's hot." Catherine found him in the kitchen 20 minutes later, mostly dry, nursing a cup of coffee while steam rose from his damp clothing. He stood when she entered, awkward in the domestic space. "Didn't mean to disturb you," he said. "Just wanted to check if you needed anything before tomorrow's stage. Weather's supposed to clear by afternoon. Actually, I'm glad you're here. We need to talk." Catherine accepted the cup of coffee Martha poured for her, noting the landlady's tactical retreat to give them privacy. "I've made my decision." Samuel set down his cup carefully, his expression guarded. "All right, I'm staying. If your offer still stands, I'll accept the arrangement." Catherine spoke steadily, watching his reaction. "But I have conditions we need to discuss before we formalize anything." Something that might have been relief flickered across Samuel's face. "Name them." "First, I want a legal document drawn up that specifies the homestead remains in my name regardless of what happens to our marriage. If circumstances become untenable, I won't be left with nothing." She paused, gauging his reaction. "I need that security." "That's fair and smart. We'll have it drafted properly and filed with the territorial records." Samuel nodded approvingly. "What else?" "Second, I want honest communication between us. If problems arise, we address them directly rather than letting resentment build. We may not have chosen this partnership conventionally, but we can choose to make it work through straightforward dealing." "Agreed. I'm not much for games or hidden meanings anyway." Catherine took a breath before the third condition. "And I want time before the marriage becomes more than a legal arrangement. I need to know you as a person, build trust, before I can consider anything beyond partnership in name." Samuel's expression remained neutral, but she saw understanding in his eyes. "However long you need, that's your right to decide, and I'll respect it." He hesitated. "Anything else?" "One more thing. I want to be involved in decisions about the property and its management. Equal partnership means equal voice in how we proceed." Catherine met his gaze directly. "I won't be a silent presence, simply accepting whatever you decide." A slow smile transformed Samuel's weathered features. "I wouldn't expect anything less, given your letters to James showed exactly that kind of mind. He'd have wanted you involved in decisions too." The reference to James carried a bittersweet note, but Catherine appreciated the acknowledgement. "Then we have an agreement. How do we proceed?" "First, visit the lawyer to get your property protection drafted. Then we see Reverend Mitchell about marriage arrangements. He'll need a few days' notice. I'd suggest we do the actual ceremony quiet and simple. Just witnesses required by law. No need for spectacle given the circumstances." Samuel picked up his coffee again. "We'll also need to outfit the cabin properly. You'll need personal items, household goods, proper clothing for homestead work. I'll cover those expenses as part of honoring James's commitment." Catherine wanted to argue about the expenses but recognized the practicality. She had almost no money left and would need significant supplies to establish herself. "I'll keep account of what's spent. Once the homestead is producing income, I'll contribute my share." If it makes you feel better to track it, fine, but I'm not keeping score. Samuel drained his coffee. Rain's letting up. We could visit the lawyer this afternoon if you're willing. They made their way through muddy streets to a modest office where a sign proclaimed Theodore Walsh, attorney at law. The lawyer turned out to be a thin man in his 50s with ink-stained fingers and a precise manner of speaking. After hearing their situation, Walsh nodded thoughtfully. Unusual circumstances, but not without precedent in frontier territories. Miss Winters, you're wise to protect your interests legally. He began making notes. I'll draft a document specifying that the homestead property and any improvements thereto remain solely in your name, separate from marital assets. Mr. Hartley will have right of residence and working partnership, but no ownership claim should the marriage dissolve. That's acceptable, Samuel confirmed. Walsh continued writing. I'll also include provisions specifying your rights to any profits generated by the property's operations, and protections ensuring you can't be forced from the land. This will be filed with territorial records, making it legally binding and a matter of public record. They spent the next hour working through details and language. Catherine was impressed by Walsh's thoroughness and his evident respect for her right to protect herself legally. When they finally signed the preliminary documents, she felt the first real sense of security since learning of James's death. I'll have the final version ready for signature tomorrow, Walsh said. Then we'll file it immediately. In the meantime, I'd recommend you complete the marriage ceremony as soon as possible. It will strengthen your claim to the homestead under federal homesteading law. Outside the lawyer's office, the rain had stopped completely, leaving the air fresh and clean. Catherine felt lighter somehow, as if signing those papers had transferred some of her burden of uncertainty to concrete legal protections. Thank you for agreeing to those terms, she said to Samuel as they walked back toward the boarding house. I know it's unusual for a man to sign away property rights. It's unusual for a woman to arrive expecting to marry one man and end up with his brother instead. Unusual is already established. Samuel's tone was dry. Besides, James wanted you to have security. This ensures that, regardless of what happens between us. They were passing the general store when Robert Garrison emerged, flanked by two men Catherine hadn't seen before. Garrison's expression showed calculated friendliness that didn't reach his eyes. Hartley, Miss Winters, what fortunate timing. Garrison gestured to his companions. Allow me to introduce Marcus Webb and his associate, Mr. Chen. They're investors from Denver, interested in timber rights throughout the territory. The shorter of the two men, Webb, stepped forward with an oily smile. Pleasure to meet you both. Mr. Garrison has been telling us about the excellent timber stands in this area. We're looking to secure long-term harvesting contracts. Samuel's posture had gone rigid. The timber on the Hartley homestead isn't for sale or lease. Ah, but perhaps Miss Winters has a different perspective, Webb said smoothly, turning to Catherine. As I understand it, you're new to the territory and may not fully appreciate the financial opportunities available. We're prepared to offer very generous terms for selective harvesting rights. Catherine felt the trap being laid. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Webb, but I'm not interested in selling rights to property I'm invested in preserving. Not selling, my dear. Leasing. You'd retain ownership while gaining substantial income from an underutilized resource. Webb's smile widened. A woman in your position, newly arrived and facing uncertain prospects, should consider every avenue for financial security. Miss Winters's prospects are quite certain, actually, Samuel interjected coldly. We're to be married this week. The homestead will be a family operation, not a commercial timber source. The statement landed like a stone in water, ripples of surprise spreading across the faces of Garrison and his associates. Catherine saw calculation in Garrison's eyes as he reassessed the situation. Married? How wonderfully convenient. Garrison's tone dripped with false warmth. Though I'm sure the good people of Copper Falls will find it interesting how quickly such arrangements can be made. Poor James is barely cold in his grave, and already his brother is stepping into his shoes. Our arrangements are none of your concern, Garrison. Samuel's voice carried a warning edge. And you'd do well to remember that spreading gossip about a lady's reputation has consequences. No gossip, merely observation. Garrison spread his hands innocently. Still, I'm sure Miss Winters understands that reputation matters in a small community. People talk, make judgments. A woman's standing can be quite fragile, especially when circumstances appear irregular. The threat was barely veiled. Catherine felt anger rise, replacing her initial unease. Mr. Garrison, I've found that people of genuine character judge based on actions rather than appearances. Those whose opinions are swayed by malicious gossip aren't people whose regard I value anyway. Webb stepped in before Garrison could respond. Perhaps we've gotten off on the wrong foot. The timber offer stands regardless of your marital plans, Miss Winters. When you've had time to settle in and understand the financial realities of frontier life, we'd be happy to discuss it further. The answer will remain the same, Catherine said firmly. Good day, gentlemen. She turned and walked away, Samuel falling into step beside her. They didn't speak until they'd put distance between themselves and Garrison's group. That was well handled, Samuel said quietly. Garrison expected you to be intimidated. I've dealt with bullies in Boston drawing rooms. They're the same breed regardless of setting. They prey on perceived weakness and retreat when confronted. Catherine's hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline, but her voice remained steady. Though I suspect we've made an enemy. Garrison was already an enemy the moment James refused to sell him timber rights. This just confirmed it. Samuel's expression was grim. But he's a problem I know how to handle. He plays games with business and social pressure, but he's a coward at heart. Stand firm, and he usually backs down. They reached the boarding house to find Martha Brennan waiting with news. Dr. Morrison's wife stopped by looking for you, Miss Winters. She's hoping you'll join the ladies' sewing circle tomorrow afternoon. Meets at the church, 2 o'clock. Catherine glanced at Samuel, uncertain. I'm not sure of my schedule. You should. Go, Samuel interrupted. Good way to meet the women of the community properly. Start building connections. I'll handle the supply purchasing tomorrow morning. Bring everything to the homestead. We can move you out there Friday after the ceremony. The practical planning helped ground Catherine in the reality of what she was undertaking. All right, I'll attend the sewing circle. That evening, Catherine joined the Brennan family for dinner again, and this time Rose approached her with obvious excitement. Is it true you're marrying Samuel Hartley? The whole town's talking about it. News travels quickly here, Catherine observed. Everything travels quickly in Copper Falls, Martha said dryly. You'll get used to it. The question is, are you prepared for the attention? Folks will have opinions about such a rapid marriage, especially given the circumstances. Let them have opinions. Samuel and I know our own minds. Catherine surprised herself with the firmness in her voice. We're making the best of difficult circumstances in a way that honors James's wishes and provides security for both of us. Anyone who sees something scandalous has more imagination than sense. Martha's eyes twinkled. Good answer. You'll do fine here, Miss Winters. Backbone is more valuable than refinement on the frontier. Later, alone in her room, Catherine allowed herself to fully consider what the next days would bring. She'd committed to marrying a man she barely knew, moving to an isolated homestead, building a life in a place utterly foreign to everything she'd experienced. The enormity of it should have been paralyzing, but instead she felt a strange sense of purpose. A knock interrupted her thoughts. Martha stood in the hallway holding a wrapped bundle. This belonged to my mother. I'd like you to have it. Catherine unwrapped the package to find a beautiful quilt, hand-stitched in a pattern of interlocking rings. The fabric was worn, but the craftsmanship was exquisite. It's called a double wedding ring pattern, Martha explained. Mother made it for my wedding 30 years ago. I never had daughters who married, and my girls are too modern for such old-fashioned sentiments. But you're starting a new life in challenging circumstances, and I thought you might appreciate having something made with love and hope. Catherine's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. Mrs. Brennan, this is too generous. Nonsense. It's a gift freely given. Consider it a wedding present and a welcome to Copper Falls. Martha patted her arm. You're going to need friends here, Catherine. I hope you'll count me among them. I do, thank you. After Martha left, Catherine spread the quilt across her bed, admiring the intricate stitching and the careful color choices that created the interlocking pattern. It was a tangible reminder that she wasn't entirely alone in this venture, that community and connection were available if she was willing to reach for them. Thursday morning, dawned clear and bright, the storm having washed the air clean. Catherine dressed in her best remaining dress and made her way to the church for the sewing circle, carrying a pillowcase she'd been embroidering as her contribution to the work. 8 women of varying ages gathered in the church's small side room, their conversation halting as Catherine entered. Dr. Morrison's wife, a capable-looking woman in her 40s, rose to greet her. "Miss Winters, I'm so glad you came. I'm Helen Morrison. Please join us." She made introductions around the circle, a mix of merchants' wives, ranchers' wives, and 2 unmarried sisters who ran the town's bakery. The work was mending and creating items for families in need, a practical charity that Catherine could respect. As they stitched, the conversation flowed carefully around topics that skirted but didn't directly address Catherine's situation. It was Helen Morrison who finally broached the subject directly. "We heard you're planning to marry Samuel Hartley. That's quite a decision to make so quickly after arriving." Catherine kept her stitching steady, refusing to be flustered. "The circumstances are unusual, certainly, but Samuel is honoring his brother's commitment, and I'm accepting that offer as the best path forward for everyone involved." "Samuel's a good man," one of the rancher's wives offered. "Quiet, but solid. He helped my husband repair our barn last winter. Wouldn't take payment." "He's nothing like James, though," another woman said. "James was sociable, friendly with everyone. Samuel keeps to himself mostly." "Different temperaments don't necessarily mean better or worse," Catherine replied. "Simply different. I'm learning to appreciate Samuel's particular qualities." Helen Morrison gave her an approving look. "Well said. And for what it's worth, I think you're showing considerable courage. Frontier life isn't easy even with ideal circumstances. Making it work under challenging conditions takes real strength." The conversation moved to other topics. Upcoming harvest celebrations, the new school teacher expected to arrive next month, concerns about early snow this year. Catherine contributed where she could, learning about community rhythms and relationships. As the gathering was breaking up, one of the younger women approached Catherine privately. "Miss Winters, I wanted to warn you about something. Robert Garrison has been telling people that Samuel pressured you into this marriage to get control of James's homestead. It's not true, obviously, but he's sowing seeds of gossip." Catherine felt anger flash through her. "Thank you for telling me. I appreciate the warning. Most folks don't believe Garrison. He's known for stirring trouble. But I thought you should know what's being said." Walking back to the boarding house, Catherine encountered Samuel leading a heavily loaded wagon toward the edge of town. He pulled to a stop when he saw her. "Supplies for the cabin," he explained. "Got everything on the list. Household goods, food stores, equipment, also picked up fabric and sewing notions. Martha Brennan said you'd know what you needed, so I let her choose." Catherine examined the wagon's contents, impressed by the thoroughness. "This must have cost considerably. Investment in making the homestead functional. James would have done the same." Samuel gestured to a wooden crate. "That's from Henry and Thomas at the mill. Wedding gift, they said. Haven't opened it." Catherine lifted the lid to find a beautifully carved wooden box with fitted compartments, clearly meant for storing sewing supplies or valuables. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, every joint perfect, the wood polished to a soft glow. "Thomas made it," Samuel said quietly. "He wanted you to have something fine, to welcome you properly." The gesture from the young deaf man she'd barely met touched Catherine deeply. "Please tell him I'm honored and grateful. Tell him yourself when you see him. He'll appreciate it." Samuel gathered the reins. "I'm taking this out to the cabin now, getting everything set up. Tomorrow morning we'll do the ceremony, then move you out there in the afternoon. That work for you?" "Yes, Samuel." Catherine hesitated. "I heard Garrison's been spreading talk about our arrangement, suggesting you're manipulating me for control of the property." Samuel's expression hardened. "I expected something like that. Don't let it trouble you. Actions speak louder than gossip. Once folks see us making the homestead work, building something real, the talk will fade. And if it doesn't, then we ignore it. Can't live your life worried about what small-minded people think." He studied her face. "Unless you're having second thoughts about going through with this?" Catherine met his gaze directly. "No second thoughts. I've signed legal documents protecting my interests. I'm making this choice with full knowledge and of my own free will. Anyone who suggests otherwise is simply wrong." "Good." Samuel's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Then we proceed as planned. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock at the church. Just us, the Reverend, and whatever witnesses are required. As Catherine watched him drive away with the loaded wagon, she felt the full weight of what tomorrow would bring. In less than 24 hours, she would marry a man she'd known less than a week, binding her future to his based on a promise made to a dying brother she'd never met. The situation was impossible, impractical, and utterly unlike anything she'd ever imagined for herself. And yet, she felt more certain of this choice than she had of anything in years. Friday morning arrived with crystalline clarity, the sky so blue it seemed unreal after the previous day's rain. Catherine woke before dawn, her stomach tight with nerves that had nothing to do with doubts and everything to do with the magnitude of what this day represented. She dressed carefully in her best travel suit, a deep green wool that brought out the color of her eyes. It wasn't a wedding dress in any traditional sense, but it was the finest garment she owned. Martha Brennan appeared at her door with a small bouquet of wildflowers tied with ribbon. "Every bride should have flowers," the landlady said firmly, "even under unusual circumstances." Catherine accepted them with gratitude that went beyond words. The simple gesture made the day feel less like a business transaction and more like an actual ceremony marking a genuine transition. The church was empty except for Reverend Mitchell, Samuel, and Helen Morrison with her husband, who'd agreed to serve as witnesses. Samuel wore clean dark trousers and a white shirt, his hair still damp from washing, his beard neatly trimmed. He looked uncomfortable in the formal setting, but met Catherine's eyes steadily as she approached. Reverend Mitchell was a young man, perhaps 30, with kind eyes and a gentle manner. "Miss Winters, Mr. Hartley, I understand the circumstances that bring you here today are unconventional, but I want you to know that the vows you're about to make are no less sacred or binding because of that. Marriage is a serious commitment before God and community. Do you both enter into this freely and with understanding of what you're undertaking?" "We do," Catherine and Samuel answered simultaneously. The ceremony was brief and simple. No music, no elaborate ritual, just the essential words that would bind them legally and spiritually. Catherine listened to Samuel repeat his vows in that rough voice, promising to honor and protect her, and felt the surreal quality of hearing a stranger pledge his life to hers. When it came time for her own vows, Catherine's voice was steady. She might not love Samuel Hartley, but she could promise to be faithful to their partnership, to work honestly alongside him, to build something worthwhile from this unconventional beginning. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Mitchell concluded. "Mr. Hartley, you may kiss your bride." Samuel hesitated, clearly uncertain, and Catherine appreciated his restraint. She leaned forward and kissed his cheek lightly, a gesture that fulfilled the custom without overstepping the boundaries they'd established. Something flickered in Samuel's eyes, gratitude perhaps, or relief. They signed the marriage certificate with the Morrisons as witnesses. The legal reality of what they'd done settled over Catherine like a physical weight. She was now Catherine Hartley, wife to a man she barely knew, joint heir to a frontier homestead, committed to a life she couldn't fully envision. "Congratulations to you both," Helen Morrison said warmly, embracing Catherine. "You're welcome to join us for breakfast before you head to the homestead." But before they could respond, the church door burst open. Robert Garrison strode in, flanked by two men Catherine recognized as Denver lawyers from their expensive suits and city bearing. "How fortunate to find you all here," Garrison said, his tone utterly lacking in warmth despite his smile. "Saves me the trouble of tracking you down separately. Mr. Hartley, Miss Winters, or should I say Mrs. Hartley now, these gentlemen have some legal matters to discuss with you." Samuel positioned himself slightly in front of Catherine, his body language protective. "This is neither the time nor place, Garrison. Whatever business you have can wait." "I'm afraid it can't." The taller of the two lawyers stepped forward, producing documents from his leather case. "My name is Harrison Blackwell, representing the Denver Land Company. We've filed a legal challenge to the Hartley homestead claim based on abandonment. James Hartley died over a month ago, and the property has sat vacant since then. Federal law requires continuous residence to maintain a homestead claim. Catherine felt ice slide down her spine. "The property hasn't been abandoned. Samuel has been maintaining it. Mr. Samuel Hartley filed his own homestead claim on adjacent land, which he subsequently abandoned. Blackwell continued smoothly. He cannot maintain two claims simultaneously under federal law. The original Hartley homestead has therefore sat without legal resident for 34 days, approaching the maximum allowed period before abandonment can be declared. Samuel's jaw was tight. James's death doesn't automatically void the claim. The law allows for temporary absence due to exceptional circumstances. Death is indeed exceptional, the second lawyer interjected. But without an heir taking immediate residence, the claim becomes vulnerable. We're prepared to file formal abandonment proceedings unless the current situation is resolved. Garrison's smile widened. Of course, there is a simple solution. The Denver Land Company is prepared to purchase the property outright for a fair price. You'd be relieved of the burden, compensated reasonably, and free to start fresh elsewhere. The trap was beautifully laid, Catherine realized. Garrison had been waiting for exactly this moment, knowing the property's vulnerability after James's death, timing his legal challenge for maximum impact. The property isn't for sale, she said firmly, and as of approximately 20 minutes ago, it has a legal resident, me. I'm now married to Samuel Hartley, making me James's sister-in-law and legal heir through marriage to the family claim. Blackwell's expression didn't change. That's a creative interpretation, Mrs. Hartley, but I'm afraid federal homestead law is quite specific. Marriage to a deceased claimant's brother doesn't automatically confer inheritance rights to property claims. Actually, it does in cases of family continuity. Reverend Mitchell spoke up quietly. Everyone turned to look at the young minister. I may not be a lawyer, gentlemen, but I've performed several marriages specifically for the purpose of maintaining family homestead claims after death. It's an established practice in frontier territories. Reverend Mitchell is correct, Helen Morrison added. My own cousin maintained her late husband's claim through remarriage to his brother. The territorial courts have upheld such arrangements multiple times. Blackwell exchanged glances with his associate. Perhaps, but the matter is far from settled legally. We'll be filing our challenge regardless, and a territorial judge will need to make the final determination. That process could take months, during which time the property's status remains in question. Months during which you'd tie up the land in legal proceedings, preventing any productive use or improvement, Samuel said coldly. That's the real strategy here, isn't it? Make it so expensive and complicated to fight that we're forced to sell just to end the harassment. We're simply protecting our client's legitimate interests in available land, Blackwell replied smoothly. If your claim is solid, you have nothing to fear from legal scrutiny. Garrison stepped forward. Or you could save everyone considerable time, expense, and trouble by accepting our purchase offer now, $2,500 for the property and all improvements. That's more than fair for undeveloped land. Catherine did quick calculations. The offer was probably half of what the property was actually worth, especially with James's improvements and the valuable timber stands. The answer is no. Think carefully, Mrs. Hartley. Garrison's voice hardened. Legal battles are expensive. Can you afford months of attorney fees while the property sits unproductive? And what happens if you lose? You'd have nothing and still face those legal costs. We'll manage, Samuel said flatly. Now get out of this church. You've disrupted sacred ground with your business scheming long enough. Blackwell gathered his papers. We'll be filing our challenge with the territorial court this afternoon. You'll receive official notice within the week. I suggest you secure legal counsel promptly. The three men departed, leaving silence in their wake. Catherine found she was gripping her wildflower bouquet so tightly she'd crushed some of the stems. I'm so sorry, Reverend Mitchell said quietly. Your wedding day should have been a celebration, not this. It's not your fault, Catherine managed, though I appreciate your support just now. Dr. Morrison had been silent throughout the confrontation, but now he spoke up. Samuel, you need to get to Helena immediately. Theodore Walsh is competent for basic legal work, but this requires a specialist in federal land law. I know a man there, Charles Pemberton, who's handled several complex homestead cases successfully. Helena's a 2-day journey, Samuel said, his mind clearly already calculating logistics. Catherine just arrived at the homestead, can't leave her alone there yet, and I can't afford to have the property sit unattended while Garrison's watching for any excuse to claim actual abandonment. I'll stay at the homestead, Catherine said decisively. You go to Helena, secure the attorney, and establish our legal defense. I'm perfectly capable of managing the property for a few days. Catherine, you've never lived on a frontier homestead. There are dangers, which I'll learn to handle, same as I'll learn everything else. We don't have the luxury of gradual adjustment anymore. She met his eyes. This is exactly the kind of crisis that requires us to trust each other and act decisively. You handle the legal strategy, I'll hold the property. Samuel looked like he wanted to argue, but practicality won out. All right, but I'm asking Henry Chen to check on you daily, and you'll keep the rifle loaded and accessible. I know how to shoot, Catherine said. My father insisted I learn for self-protection in Boston. I can manage a rifle. The Morrisons exchanged glances that suggested this Eastern woman was full of surprises. I'll stop by every day as well, Helen offered. Help you settle in and make sure you have what you need. And I'll send Rose out with supplies, Martha Brennan added, having appeared in the church doorway during the confrontation. News travels fast, and I wanted to see if you needed support. Looks like you do. Catherine felt overwhelming gratitude for these near strangers rallying to help. Thank you, all of you. Within 2 hours, Samuel had arranged everything. Henry Chen agreed to visit the homestead daily and help with any heavy work. Martha packed additional food supplies. Dr. Morrison wrote a letter of introduction to the Helena attorney, and Reverend Mitchell provided copies of the marriage certificate and other documentation that might prove useful in legal proceedings. Samuel loaded Catherine's trunk and supplies into the wagon, his movements efficient but tense. They drove to the homestead in near silence, both processing the dramatic turn their wedding day had taken. At the cabin, Samuel unloaded everything quickly, showing Catherine where supplies were stored, how to work the well pump, how to secure the doors and windows. His instructions came rapid fire, too much information to fully absorb. Samuel, Catherine interrupted finally. I'll figure it out. You need to leave soon to reach Helena in good time. He stopped, running a hand through his hair. I don't like leaving you alone so soon. This isn't how I planned. Plans changed. We adapt. Catherine surprised herself by reaching out and touching his arm briefly. I'm more resilient than I appear. Go secure our legal position. I'll hold things here. Samuel looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. You're remarkable. You know that? Most women would be having hysterics right now, not calmly planning defensive strategy. Hysterics serve no purpose. Action does. Catherine managed a small smile. Besides, I believe you said frontier life requires finding solutions instead of just seeing problems. I'm simply following that principle. He nodded slowly. James would have loved your spirit. Hell, I'm starting to appreciate it myself. He moved toward the door, then turned back. Catherine, I need you to know something. That promise I made to James, it started as obligation, but after meeting you, seeing how you handle challenges, I want this partnership to work because I respect who you are, not just duty anymore. The admission cost him something to make, Catherine could tell. Thank you for saying that. It matters. After Samuel departed, Catherine stood in the doorway of the cabin, watching dust from his wagon fade into the distance. Then she turned to survey her new domain with clear eyes. The cabin was well stocked but disorganized from Samuel's hurried provisioning. Catherine spent the next several hours putting everything in logical order, familiarizing herself with where supplies were kept, how the fireplace worked, the quirks of the door latch. Physical work helped calm the anxiety lurking beneath her pragmatic surface. By evening, she'd established basic routines and systems. The chickens needed feeding at dawn and dusk. Simple enough. Water came from the well, requiring more physical effort than city plumbing, but manageable. The fireplace drew well, though cooking over it would require practice. She made a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, surprised by her satisfaction at producing edible food in such primitive conditions. As darkness fell, Catherine lit the lamp and sat in James's rocking chair, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of the day. She was married, living alone in a frontier cabin, facing legal challenges that could strip away everything. It should have been overwhelming, yet Catherine felt oddly calm. For the first time in her life, she was acting rather than being acted upon, making real choices with tangible consequences instead of navigating the suffocating social expectations of Boston. A noise outside brought her to her feet. Heart pounding, she grabbed the rifle Samuel had left loaded, moving to the window. In the moonlight, she saw only the chickens settling in their coop, a deer moving through the meadow. No threat, just unfamiliar frontier sounds. Catherine forced herself to breathe normally, recognizing that fear would be her companion for a while, until these new surroundings became familiar. She checked the door was securely barred, the windows latched, then climbed to the sleeping loft with the rifle. Sleep came in fragments, her city-trained senses alert to every unfamiliar creak and rustle. But she woke at dawn intact and unreasonably proud of having survived her first night alone on the homestead. Henry Chen arrived mid-morning as promised, his son Thomas accompanying him. Through a combination of spoken words to Henry and simple gestures to Thomas, Catherine communicated her needs. Thomas immediately set to work repairing the chicken coop, while Henry helped her understand the irrigation system for the garden. "Samuel asked me to explain this carefully," Henry said, pointing to the channels James had dug. "The garden needs water every other day this time of year. Open this gate here to flood the lower sections, close it after an hour, then open the upper gate for the higher ground." Catherine took notes, asking questions until she understood the system. Thomas finished the coop repair with impressive speed and skill, his hands moving with confidence born of experience. Catherine wrote a thank you note for him, watching his face light up when Henry read it to him. After they left, Catherine practiced the irrigation system twice to ensure she could manage it alone. The physical labor was demanding but satisfying. She was learning, adapting, proving she could handle this life. Helen Morrison arrived in the afternoon with her daughter, bringing fresh bread and welcome company. "How are you managing?" "Better than expected, honestly. There's something clarifying about having concrete tasks to accomplish." Catherine poured tea. She'd managed to boil water successfully, and they sat on the porch. "I heard what happened at the church," Helen said carefully. "The whole town's talking about Garrison's legal challenge. Most folks think it's shameful, attacking you on your wedding day. What matters is whether we can defeat the challenge legally. Charles Pemberton is excellent. If anyone can build a solid defense, it's him." Helen paused. "But you should know, Garrison's been spreading more gossip, claiming Samuel married you specifically to prevent the abandonment claim, that it's a sham marriage of convenience." Catherine met her eyes directly. "It is a marriage of convenience, in a sense. Neither of us is pretending otherwise, but convenience doesn't make it invalid, and our reasons are honorable regardless of Garrison's insinuations." "I agree completely. I just wanted you to know what people are saying." Helen hesitated. "There's something else. Marcus Webb, the Denver investor, has been asking questions about you in town, about your background, your family in Boston, your financial situation." Alarm bells rang in Catherine's mind. Why would he care about my background? "I don't know, but it feels calculated, like he's looking for leverage of some kind." Helen squeezed Catherine's hand. "Just be cautious. Garrison fights dirty when he wants something." After Helen left, Catherine couldn't shake the unease. Why would Garrison's associates investigate her past? What could they possibly find in Boston that would help their legal case? Unless they weren't looking for legal ammunition, unless they were looking for personal leverage. Catherine's mind raced through possibilities. Her aunt in Boston knew only that she'd come west for a mail-order marriage. There were no scandals in her past, no secrets that could be weaponized. But the fact that they were looking suggested Garrison wasn't limiting his attack to legal channels. That night, Catherine wrote detailed letters to both her aunt and to the manager overseeing her father's affairs in Boston. She asked them to provide no information about her to anyone making inquiries, to refer all questions to her directly. The letters would take weeks to arrive, but at least she'd have established a paper trail protecting her privacy. She also began keeping a journal, documenting everything about the homestead's operation, her daily work, the improvements being made. If this ended up in court, she wanted clear evidence of active residents and productive use of the land. 3 days passed with Catherine falling into a rhythm of work and learning. She mastered the cook stove, improved her irrigation timing, even successfully butchered a chicken for dinner with help from Martha's instructions. Each small victory built her confidence. On the 4th morning, Samuel returned from Helena, looking exhausted but purposeful. Catherine was in the garden when she heard his wagon approach, and she rose to greet him with genuine gladness at seeing a familiar face. "How did it go?" she called as he climbed down. "Pemberton's taking the case. He's already drafting our response to Garrison's challenge." Samuel approached, studying her face. "You look different, more settled somehow." "I've been busy, learning, working, establishing routines." Catherine gestured toward the repaired chicken coop and the flourishing garden. "The property hasn't sat idle." Something like pride showed in Samuel's expression. "I can see that, Catherine. About leaving you alone so soon after the wedding was necessary and the right decision. We both did what needed doing." She brushed dirt from her hands. "Come inside. I'll make coffee and you can tell me everything Pemberton said." As they sat at the cabin table, Samuel explained the legal strategy. Pemberton would argue family continuity, the established precedent of remarriage maintaining homestead claims, and the evidence of continuous productive use through Samuel's maintenance, and now Catherine's residence. "He's confident?" Catherine asked. "As confident as lawyers get. The precedents are on our side, and our marriage is legally sound, but Garrison has resources to drag this out, make it expensive and complicated." Samuel paused. "There's something else?" Pemberton heard rumors that Webb's been investigating your background in Boston. Any idea what they might be looking for? Catherine told him about the letters she'd sent. "I can't imagine what they think they'll find, but I've tried to protect against them gathering information." Samuel's expression darkened. "They're looking for anything they can use to discredit you or make you appear unsuitable as a homestead claimant. Character attacks, basically. My character can withstand scrutiny. I believe that, but perception matters in legal proceedings." He met her eyes. "We need to be prepared for them to dig into your past, possibly distort facts to support their narrative that this marriage is fraudulent." Catherine felt anger rise. "Then we'll counter with the truth. Our marriage may be unconventional, but it's genuine in purpose and legal in execution. No amount of manufactured scandal changes that." Samuel's expression softened. "You're taking this remarkably well. Most people would be rattled by this level of attack." "I'm rattled," Catherine admitted, "but being rattled doesn't help. Being strategic does." She poured more coffee. "What's our next move?" "We document everything, keep records of all improvements, all work done, all productive use. We make this homestead so obviously active and well-maintained that no judge could possibly rule it abandoned." Samuel paused. "And we present ourselves as a genuine married couple, building a life together, not a convenience arrangement." Catherine understood the implication. "You think we need to appear more convincingly married?" "I think we need to be what we are, partners building something real, even if it started unconventionally. That's genuine enough to withstand scrutiny." The following weeks brought a rhythm to the homestead that surprised Catherine with its naturalness. Samuel divided his time between the sawmill and the property, arriving each evening to handle the heavier work before darkness fell. They developed an efficient partnership, communicating through gestures and brief exchanges that accomplished more than lengthy discussions. Catherine had discovered she possessed an aptitude for homestead management that her Boston upbringing had never hinted at. The garden flourished under her attention, the chickens produced steady eggs, and she'd even begun learning to preserve food for the coming winter. Each competency gained felt like a small victory against the chaos Garrison's legal challenge had introduced. But the legal battle ground forward with frustrating slowness. Pemberton filed their response, Garrison's lawyers countered, and the territorial judge scheduled a hearing for late October, still 3 weeks away. Meanwhile, Webb's investigation into Catherine's background continued, though what he'd discovered remained unclear. On a crisp morning in early October, Catherine was working in the garden when she heard horses approaching. 3 riders emerged from the tree line: Robert Garrison, Marcus Webb, and a woman Catherine didn't recognize. The woman was perhaps 40, elegantly dressed for frontier standards, with sharp features and calculating eyes. Catherine stood slowly, wiping dirt from her hands, positioning herself where she could reach the cabin and the rifle inside if necessary. "Gentlemen, ma'am, you're on private property." Garrison dismounted with practiced ease. Mrs. Hartley, allow me to introduce Mrs. Constance Aldridge. She's traveled quite a distance to speak with you. The woman dismounted as well, studying Catherine with undisguised interest. Miss Winters, forgive me, Mrs. Hartley. I've come from Boston with information I believe you'll find enlightening. Catherine's stomach tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. I can't imagine what business brings someone from Boston all the way to Colorado territory. Family business, actually. Mrs. Aldridge smiled without warmth. I'm your late father's cousin, though we've never met. Your aunt sent me when she received inquiries about your circumstances. This was a lie. Catherine's father had no cousin named Aldridge. But before she could challenge it, Mrs. Aldridge continued smoothly. Your aunt was quite concerned to learn you'd entered into marriage with a stranger mere days after arriving in Colorado. She asked me to ensure you weren't being coerced or taken advantage of. Mrs. Aldridge's tone dripped full sympathy, particularly given your delicate situation. What delicate situation? Catherine's voice was cold. Webb stepped forward, producing papers from his coat. We've discovered some interesting facts about your circumstances in Boston, Mrs. Hartley. Your father's business was in significant debt when he died. You fled east to avoid creditors, using a mail-order marriage arrangement as escape from financial obligations. The accusation was so absurd, Catherine almost laughed. That's completely false. My father's business was profitable and well managed. Then perhaps you can explain these documents? Webb handed her several papers. Catherine scanned them quickly, her blood running cold. They appeared to be ledger entries showing substantial debts and a notice of pending legal action against the estate of her father. The documents were forgeries. They had to be, but they looked official enough to be convincing to someone unfamiliar with her father's actual affairs. These are fabrications, Catherine said firmly. My father's business records are matter of public filing in Boston. Anyone can verify these claims are false? Can they? Garrison smiled. Verification takes time, Mrs. Hartley. Months, probably, to send inquiries to Boston and receive responses. Meanwhile, these documents raise serious questions about your character and your motivations for this hasty marriage. Catherine saw the strategy clearly now. They couldn't prove the homestead was abandoned, so they were attacking her credibility instead. If they could make her appear a fortune hunter or fraudster, they could argue the marriage was invalid and therefore couldn't maintain the homestead claim. My character and motivations are irrelevant to federal homestead law, Catherine said. The marriage is legal, I'm in residence, and the property is being actively improved. Whatever invented scandals you've concocted don't change those facts. Mrs. Aldridge stepped closer, her expression shifting to false concern. My dear, I understand you're in a difficult position, but you must see how this appears. A woman of education and refinement, suddenly marrying a rough frontier laborer she barely knows, claiming property through a dead man's legacy. It suggests desperation at best, calculation at worst. What it suggests is that I'm capable of making my own choices and building my own future, Catherine shot back. Something you clearly find threatening enough to fabricate evidence against. We're offering you a way out, Garrison interjected smoothly. Admit the marriage was entered into solely to maintain the property claim. Accept our purchase offer. We'll increase it to $3,000. You can return to Boston with enough money to settle any debts and start fresh. No scandal, no legal consequences. And if I refuse? Webb's expression hardened. Then we present this evidence to the territorial judge. We'll argue the marriage is fraudulent, entered into under false pretenses by a woman fleeing debts and legal troubles. The judge will likely invalidate both the marriage and your claim to the homestead. Catherine felt rage building beneath her controlled exterior. You've constructed an elaborate fiction based on forged documents. Any competent investigation will expose it as the fraud it is. Perhaps, Garrison conceded, but as you noted, verification takes time. By the time the truth emerges, the legal proceedings will have cost you everything. Can you afford months of attorney fees while your reputation is destroyed in this community? The threat was clear and effective. Even if Catherine ultimately proved her innocence, The process would be devastating, and there was no guarantee a territorial judge wouldn't be swayed by the forged evidence in the interim. "I need to consult with my husband before making any decisions," Catherine said, buying time to think. "Of course, you have until tomorrow afternoon." Garrison remounted his horse. "But I'd urge you to consider carefully, Mrs. Hartley. Pride is expensive. Sometimes accepting reality and moving forward is the wiser choice." After they departed, Catherine stood trembling with anger and fear. She needed to reach Samuel immediately, but he was at the sawmill 3 miles away and wouldn't return until evening. The morning stretched before her with agonizing slowness. She tried to focus on work, but her mind kept circling the problem. The forged documents were good enough to be convincing. Proving them false would require contacting Boston, gathering evidence, mounting a defense that would take weeks or months. Meanwhile, the hearing was only 3 weeks away. By the time Samuel's wagon appeared in late afternoon, Catherine had worked herself into controlled fury. She met him as he drove up, her expression alerting him immediately that something was wrong. "What happened?" Catherine explained the visit, showing him the forged documents. Samuel's expression grew darker with each detail. "This is beyond legal maneuvering. This is criminal fraud." He examined the papers closely. "These are well done, though. Whoever created them knew what they were doing. Can we prove they're false in time for the hearing?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know. Pemberton would need to initiate inquiries to Boston, gather your father's actual records, coordinate with authorities there. It's possible, but the timeline is tight. Garrison knows that. He's counting on us being unable to mount an effective defense quickly enough." Catherine paced the cabin floor. "If we can't prove these are forgeries before the hearing, the judge might rule against us based solely on the appearance of impropriety. Then we need a different strategy." Samuel set the papers down. "We go on offense instead of defense. We expose Garrison's entire scheme, the timberland grab, the orchestrated legal challenge, now this fraudulent evidence. We make the case that he's engaged in a conspiracy to steal property through illegal means." "How do we prove conspiracy?" "By connecting the pieces publicly. Garrison wanted James's timber rights. James refused. James dies. Garrison immediately files abandonment claims. When we counter with our marriage, he manufactures evidence to discredit you." Samuel's eyes were hard. "The pattern is clear to anyone willing to see it." Catherine felt hope stirring. "We need allies, people willing to testify about Garrison's character and his previous attempts to acquire the property." "I can get that. There are others Garrison's tried to pressure or cheat over the years. They'll talk if it means stopping him." Samuel paused. "But there's a risk. Going after Garrison directly could make him more dangerous. He has resources and connections we don't. He's already dangerous. At least this way we're fighting back instead of just defending." Catherine met Samuel's gaze. "I didn't come this far to be driven off by forged documents and threats." Something shifted in Samuel's expression, respect mixed with something warmer. "All right, we fight. I'll ride to Helena tomorrow, brief Pemberton on these new developments. You gather documentation of everything here, the improvements, the work completed, evidence of productive use. We build an overwhelming case that this is a legitimate homestead operated by a legitimate married couple. What about Mrs. Aldridge's claim to be my father's cousin? Almost certainly another actor Garrison hired. I'll have Pemberton investigate her background too." Samuel moved closer, his voice softening. "Catherine, I need to know, is there anything in your actual past that could be used against you? Any debts? Any legal troubles? Anything that gives foundation to these lies?" "Nothing. My father died with his affairs in perfect order. I have no debts, no legal entanglements, no scandals." Catherine held his gaze. "I'm exactly who I've presented myself to be." "I believe you." The simple statement carried weight. "Then we proceed with a clear conscience and fight this with everything we have." That night, Catherine couldn't sleep. She lay in the loft, listening to Samuel's steady breathing from the main room where he'd taken to sleeping on a bedroll near the fireplace. The arrangement maintained their agreement about boundaries while ensuring the property always had someone in residence. She thought about how much had changed in the weeks since her arrival. This cabin had become home in ways her aunt's Boston house never had. The work was demanding but satisfying, and Samuel Hartley, the stranger she'd married out of necessity, had become someone she genuinely respected and was beginning to trust. The next morning, Samuel departed for Helena before dawn. Catherine threw herself into documentation, creating detailed records of every improvement made to the property, every hour of labor invested, every productive use of the land. She photographed the garden, the repaired buildings, the irrigation systems, using the small camera Samuel had purchased specifically for this purpose. Helen Morrison arrived mid-morning with news. The whole town's buzzing about Garrison's accusations. Most people don't believe them. They know your character from observing you these past weeks. But there are always those willing to believe the worst. What matters is what the judge believes, Catherine said, though the community's support meant more than she'd expected. Actually, public opinion might matter more than you think. Helen leaned forward conspiratorially. Reverend Mitchell is organizing something. He's asking townspeople to provide sworn statements about your character and the legitimacy of your marriage. He thinks a show of community support could influence the judge's perception. Catherine felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. That's incredibly kind. It's more than kindness. It's justice. Most folks here know Garrison for what he is. They're tired of watching him manipulate the system. Helen squeezed Catherine's hand. You're not alone in this fight. Over the next several days, Catherine continued her meticulous documentation while a steady stream of visitors arrived at the homestead. The Brennans, Dr. Morrison, Reverend Mitchell, even Harold Winters from the timber company, all came to offer support and provide statements for Pemberton's case. Henry and Thomas Chen arrived with particularly valuable testimony. Through written statement, Henry detailed how Garrison had tried to force him into unfavorable timber contracts, threatening to destroy his livelihood if he refused. The pattern of intimidation and manipulation stretched back years. Many people afraid to speak against Garrison, Henry explained. He has power, connections, but Samuel, good man, you good woman, worth the risk to help. Samuel returned from Helena on the 5th day with Pemberton himself in tow. The attorney was a lean man in his 50s, with silver hair and penetrating eyes. He examined Catherine's documentation with evident approval. This is excellent work, Mrs. Hartley. Very thorough. He set down the papers. Combined with the community statements and my investigation into those forged documents, we have the foundation for a strong defense. I've also filed a formal complaint against Garrison for fraud and attempted property theft through false evidence. Will that stop the hearing? Catherine asked. No, but it shifts the narrative. Now Garrison's the one facing potential criminal charges, not you. Pemberton's expression was grim. However, I must warn you, the judge assigned to this case, Martin Thorndale, has business connections to Garrison, not direct enough to require recusal, but enough to raise concerns about impartiality. Samuel's hands clenched. So even with strong evidence, we might lose because the judge is in Garrison's pocket. It's a risk, which is why I've requested federal oversight given the nature of the homestead claim. Pemberton pulled out another document. Federal land claims fall under federal jurisdiction. I've petitioned to have this moved to federal court in Denver, where Garrison's influence doesn't reach. Catherine felt hope surge. Can you do that? It's within my rights to request it. Whether the request is granted depends on factors beyond my control. Pemberton gathered his papers. But even the petition itself puts pressure on Judge Thorndale. If he rules against you and we appeal based on bias, his decision could be overturned and his reputation damaged. Most judges prefer to avoid that scenario. The legal maneuvering was complex, but Catherine understood the essential strategy: create enough procedural obstacles and public scrutiny that Garrison's advantages became liabilities. When is the hearing? She asked. 1 week from today, and I should mention Garrison has requested you both appear in person to testify. He's likely planning to attack you directly under oath, try to catch you in inconsistencies, or make you appear unreliable. Catherine felt her stomach tighten but kept her voice steady. Then we'll need to prepare thoroughly. Indeed, Pemberton studied her carefully. Mrs. Hartley, they're going to ask invasive questions about your marriage, your relationship with Samuel, your motivations for coming west. They'll try to make you defensive or emotional. Can you handle that kind of interrogation? I can handle whatever's necessary to protect what we've built here. Pemberton smiled slightly. Good, because Garrison's biggest mistake was underestimating you. Let's make sure he regrets it. The week before the hearing passed, in intense preparation. Pemberton drilled Catherine and Samuel on testimony, anticipating every hostile question Garrison's lawyers might ask. They practiced maintaining composure under pressure, presenting a unified front, defending their choices without appearing defensive. Evenings after Pemberton retired to the spare room they'd prepared for him, Catherine and Samuel sat on the cabin porch talking. The conversations ranged from legal strategy to personal history, each learning more about the other with each passing day. "Tell me about James," Catherine said one evening. "What was he like as a boy?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment. "Gentler than me, more patient. Our mother used to say James got all the sweetness and I got all the stubbornness." His voice softened with memory. "But he was tougher than he looked. When our parents died, he was the one who kept us together, made me see we could build something better out west." "You miss him terribly?" "Every day, but less sharply now somehow." Samuel glanced at her. "Having you here, seeing this place actually becoming what James envisioned, it helps, makes his death feel less like pure loss and more like transformation." Catherine understood what he meant. "I wish I could have known him. You would have liked each other. He had your same directness, your way of seeing clearly through complications." Samuel paused. "Though I think you and I suit in ways he and I did. You're not afraid of hard work or difficult choices. Neither am I. That's a solid foundation for partnership. Is that what we are now? Partners?" Samuel met her eyes. "I think we've been partners since you agreed to stay. The marriage certificate just made it official." He hesitated. "Though I hope we're becoming something more than business partners. Friends, maybe." "Friends," Catherine agreed, surprised by how much she meant it. The night before the hearing, Catherine lay awake running through potential questions and answers. Everything they'd built hung in balance. The homestead, the future, even the fragile connection growing between her and Samuel. But for the first time since Garrison's challenge began, Catherine felt genuinely confident. They had evidence, community support, and a strategy. More importantly, they had the truth on their side and the determination to fight for it. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. The territorial courthouse in Copper Falls was a modest wooden structure that served double duty as town hall and occasional church venue. By the time Catherine and Samuel arrived on the morning of the hearing, a crowd had already gathered, far more people than the small building could accommodate. Catherine wore her best dress, the deep green wool she'd worn for the wedding, her hair arranged in a neat bun that projected competence and respectability. Samuel had donned his only suit, looking uncomfortable but dignified. Pemberton walked between them, carrying a leather case bulging with documents. "The crowd's a good sign," Pemberton murmured. "Public interest puts pressure on the judge to rule fairly." Inside, the courtroom was already packed. Catherine recognized faces from town: the Brennans, the Morrisons, Reverend Mitchell, Henry and Thomas Chen. Even Harold Winters sat in the back row, his presence a quiet statement of support. But she also saw unfamiliar faces, likely brought in by Garrison to create the appearance of community opposition. Judge Martin Thorndale presided from behind a scarred oak desk that served as the bench. He was perhaps 60, with iron-grey hair and a face that gave away nothing. Garrison sat at the opposing table with his attorneys, Blackwell and the second lawyer whose name Catherine had learned was Simmons. Mrs. Aldridge sat behind them, her expression smugly confident. "All rise," called the bailiff, though most were already standing due to lack of seating. "The Territorial Court of Colorado is now in session. The Honorable Judge Thorndale presiding." Thorndale surveyed the crowded room with evident displeasure. "This is a land claim hearing, not a social gathering. I'll have order and proper courtroom decorum, or I'll clear the room entirely. Is that understood?" A murmur of assent rippled through the crowd. Everyone sat where they could. The rest remained standing along the walls. "We're here to determine the validity of the homestead claim on the former James Hartley property," Thorndale began. "Mr. Blackwell, present your challenge." Blackwell stood smoothly. "Your Honor, we contend that the property claim became void upon James Hartley's death due to abandonment. While the defendant has attempted to maintain the claim through marriage to the deceased's brother, we have substantial evidence that this marriage is fraudulent, entered into solely to circumvent homestead law and executed by individuals of questionable character and motivation. That's a serious allegation. What evidence supports it? Blackwell presented the forged financial documents, Mrs. Aldridge's false testimony about Catherine's supposed debts, and a timeline arguing the marriage happened too quickly after James's death to be genuine. He painted Catherine as a desperate fortune hunter, and Samuel as complicit in a scheme to steal valuable property. Catherine forced herself to remain impassive, though fury burned beneath her calm exterior. The lies were delivered with such conviction they might have been persuasive to someone unfamiliar with the actual facts. When Blackwell finished, Pemberton stood. "Your Honor, if I may address these allegations before we present our defense." "Proceed." "The financial documents presented by opposing counsel are forgeries. I have here the actual records from Boston." Pemberton produced a thick folder, obtained directly from the city records office and verified by 3 independent accountants. Jonathan Winters died with his affairs in perfect order. His daughter Catherine inherited a modest but debt-free estate. There were no creditors, no legal troubles, no financial desperation. Blackwell's expression flickered with surprise. Pemberton had worked faster than expected. Furthermore, Mrs. Constance Aldridge is not related to the Winters family in any way. She's actually Constance Merrill, an actress hired by Mr. Garrison's associate Marcus Webb. I have sworn testimony from the theatrical company in Denver that employed her, including the payment records for her services in this deception. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Mrs. Aldridge's face had gone pale. Thorndale's expression remained neutral, but Catherine saw his eyes sharpen with interest. "These are serious counter-allegations, Mr. Pemberton. Can you substantiate them?" "Completely, Your Honor. I also have evidence of a pattern of intimidation and fraudulent practices by Mr. Garrison in his attempts to acquire property throughout this region. I've prepared a formal complaint for criminal fraud charges, which I'll be filing with federal authorities regardless of this hearing's outcome." Now, Garrison's face showed reaction, a tightening around the eyes, a tension in his posture. The hearing was not going as he'd planned. Thorndale examined the documents Pemberton provided, taking his time. The courtroom waited in tense silence. Finally, the judge looked up. "Mr. Blackwell, these financial records appear authentic and directly contradict your evidence. Do you wish to withdraw your character allegations against Mrs. Hartley?" Blackwell conferred quietly with Garrison before responding. "Your Honor, even setting aside the financial questions, the timeline of the marriage remains suspicious. The defendants married within days of Mrs. Hartley's arrival, before she could possibly have known Samuel Hartley well enough for a genuine union." "Let's address that directly then," Thorndale said. "Mrs. Hartley, please take the stand." Catherine moved to the witness chair, her heart pounding but her outward composure intact. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. Thorndale studied her carefully. "Mrs. Hartley, why did you come to Colorado Territory? To marry James Hartley, Your Honor? We corresponded for 18 months. He'd asked me to be his wife, and I accepted. And when you learn of his death, I was devastated. The future I'd planned disappeared in an instant." Catherine kept her voice steady. "Samuel offered to honor his brother's commitment by marrying me himself. It wasn't what I'd expected, but it offered security and the chance to build the life James had described." "So you married a complete stranger for security?" Catherine met the judge's eyes directly. "I married Samuel Hartley because he demonstrated honor, integrity, and commitment to his brother's memory, because the homestead represented real opportunity for meaningful work and independence, and because I believed we could build a genuine partnership even if it started unconventionally. Has that belief proven correct?" "Yes, Your Honor. Samuel and I have developed mutual respect and trust. We work together effectively, make decisions jointly, and are building something worthwhile on that property." Blackwell stood. "Your Honor, I'd like to cross-examine." "Proceed." Blackwell approached with predatory confidence. "Mrs. Hartley, you claim mutual respect and trust, yet you and your husband maintain separate sleeping quarters. Hardly the behavior of a genuine married couple?" Catherine had anticipated this question. "We maintain separate quarters at my request, out of respect for the unconventional nature of our union. I wanted time to know Samuel before the marriage became more than a legal partnership. He honored that request without complaint." "How convenient. And how long do you plan to maintain this arrangement?" "Until I decide otherwise. The pace of our relationship's development is our private concern, not a matter for public determination. But it does speak to the authenticity of the marriage, wouldn't you say? Pemberton stood. Objection, Your Honor. The legal validity of marriage doesn't require consummation, and the intimate details of the defendant's relationship aren't relevant to homestead law. Sustained. Mr. Blackwell, confine your questions to relevant matters. Blackwell changed tactics. Mrs. Hartley, you claim you and your husband make decisions jointly, yet Samuel Hartley was absent from the property for 5 days recently, while traveling to Helena. How is that joint decision-making? Samuel went to Helena to secure legal counsel for this very hearing, a decision we made together because it was necessary for our defense. I remained at the homestead, maintaining productive use of the land, also a decision we made jointly. Partnership doesn't require constant physical proximity, and you felt comfortable managing a frontier homestead alone after only weeks of residence. I learned quickly. Henry Chen and his son checked on me daily. Helen Morrison visited regularly. I had support from the community while developing necessary skills. Catherine leaned forward slightly. Mr. Blackwell, I think you underestimate what women are capable of when given opportunity and necessity. A ripple of approval ran through the spectators. Thorndale's expression might have held a hint of a smile. Blackwell tried several more lines of questioning, but Catherine answered each calmly and directly. The more he pressed, the more she demonstrated competence, intelligence, and genuine commitment to the homestead and her marriage. Finally, Blackwell returned to his seat. No further questions. Mr. Hartley, please take the stand, Thorndale directed. Samuel moved to the witness chair with visible discomfort. He was a man more at ease with physical work than formal proceedings. But when he spoke, his voice was steady. Pemberton questioned him first, establishing the timeline of James's death, the deathbed promise, and Samuel's motivations for honoring it. Samuel's answers were straightforward and unembellished, carrying the ring of truth through their simplicity. Why did you agree to marry a woman you'd never met? Pemberton asked. Because my brother asked me to. And he'd never asked me for anything important before, because Catherine deserved the life James had promised her, and because it was the right thing to do. Samuel paused. I didn't expect to actually come to care about her as a person. That was unexpected, but welcome. The admission clearly surprised the courtroom. Catherine felt warmth spread through her chest at his public acknowledgement. Blackwell's cross-examination focused on the property's value and Samuel's financial interest in maintaining the claim. But Samuel deflected easily. I make good money from the sawmill. Don't need the homestead for financial security. I'm doing this because James built something worthwhile there, and Catherine's proven she can make it thrive. That matters more than property value. So you're saying you receive no benefit from this arrangement? I didn't say that. I benefit from having a capable partner, from seeing James's dream realized, from building something meaningful. Those are real benefits, just not the mercenary kind you're implying. When both attorneys finished questioning, Pemberton called his supporting witnesses. Reverend Mitchell testified about the legitimacy of the marriage ceremony. Helen Morrison spoke to Catherine's character and rapid integration into the community. Henry Chen provided devastating testimony about Garrison's history of intimidation and manipulation. Harold Winters took the stand and dropped a bombshell. Garrison approached me 6 months ago trying to arrange a deal. He wanted me to refuse to sell lumber to Samuel Hartley, create pressure to force him out of business. Said if I cooperated, he'd guarantee favorable contracts for my timber company. I refused, and he's been trying to undercut my business ever since. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Thorndale gavelled for silence. Mr. Garrison, you'll have an opportunity to respond to these allegations. But Garrison's facade was crumbling. His attorneys conferred frantically, clearly unprepared for the weight of evidence against their client. Pemberton's final witness was Samuel's sawmill foreman. I've known Samuel Hartley for 4 years. He's the most honest man I've worked for. When he says he's honoring his brother's promise, that's exactly what he's doing. No hidden motives, no schemes. Just a man trying to do right by his family. After all testimony concluded, Thorndale called a brief recess. Catherine and Samuel waited outside with Pemberton, the crowd offering quiet words of encouragement. How do you think it went? Catherine asked Pemberton. Better than I hoped. Thorndale's harder to read than most judges, but the evidence is overwhelmingly in our favor. Garrison overplayed his hand with those forgeries. Pemberton's expression was cautiously optimistic, but nothing certain until we hear the ruling. When court reconvened, Thorndale surveyed the room with an unreadable expression. I've heard extensive testimony today about property claims, marriage validity, and character. I've reviewed substantial documentation regarding the history of this claim and the circumstances surrounding its current status. Catherine gripped Samuel's hand under the table, needing the anchor of physical connection. The allegations of financial impropriety and fraudulent marriage appear to be without foundation. The evidence presented by the defense convincingly demonstrates Mrs. Hartley's legitimate circumstances and the genuine nature of the marriage between her and Mr. Samuel Hartley. The forged documents and false testimony represent serious criminal conduct that I'll be referring to territorial authorities for prosecution. Relief flooded through Catherine, but Thorndale wasn't finished. However, the original question remains: can a homestead claim be maintained through marriage to a deceased claimant's family member? This is where federal homestead law becomes complex. Catherine's relief turned to anxiety. Was Thorndale about to rule against them, despite discrediting Garrison's evidence? After careful consideration, I find that the marriage between Catherine Winters and Samuel Hartley, while unconventional in timing, is legally valid and was entered into with genuine intent to honor familial obligations and maintain productive use of the property. The evidence shows continuous improvement and residence since James Hartley's death, first through Samuel's maintenance and subsequently through Catherine's active occupation. Thorndale paused, his gaze settling on Catherine and Samuel. What I see here is not fraud or opportunism, but rather two people making the best of tragic circumstances while honoring commitments and building something worthwhile. That strikes me as entirely consistent with the spirit of homestead law, which rewards productive use and good faith development of frontier land. Catherine's heart was pounding so hard she could barely hear over it. Therefore, I rule in favor of the defendants. The homestead claim remains valid. Catherine and Samuel Hartley retain full rights to the property. Furthermore, I'm issuing a restraining order preventing Mr. Garrison or his associates from harassing the defendants or interfering with their property rights. This matter is concluded. The courtroom erupted in applause and cheers. Catherine turned to Samuel, finding his eyes bright with emotion that matched her own. Without thinking, she embraced him, feeling his arms close around her in return. The hug was brief but genuine, a shared moment of victory and relief. Pemberton was shaking their hands, accepting congratulations from supporters who pressed forward. Garrison and his lawyers left quickly, avoiding eye contact, their defeat complete and public. Outside the courthouse, the celebration continued. Martha Brennan produced a cake she'd baked in optimistic anticipation of victory. Helen Morrison organized an impromptu gathering at the church. The community that had supported Catherine and Samuel's fight now welcomed them fully as members. Later, as the sun set and the celebration wound down, Catherine and Samuel drove back to the homestead in companionable silence. The familiar landscape looked different somehow, more like home now that its future was secure. At the cabin, Samuel helped Catherine down from the wagon, but instead of releasing her hand immediately, he held it a moment longer. "I meant what I said in court," he said quietly, "about coming to care for you. That wasn't just strategy." Catherine met his eyes, seeing vulnerability there she'd never witnessed before. "I know, I feel the same. So, where does that leave us?" Samuel's voice was careful, not presuming anything. "We started as strangers fulfilling a promise. We became partners, building a homestead. What are we now?" Catherine considered the question seriously. "I think we're two people who've been through something extraordinary together and discovered we suit each other. Not in the way I would have suited James, perhaps, but in a way that works for who we actually are. Is that enough?" "It's more than enough. It's genuine," Catherine smiled. "I came west expecting a conventional marriage to a gentleman who wrote beautiful letters. Instead, I got an unconventional marriage to a gruff man who shows care through actions rather than words. I think I prefer reality." Samuel's expression softened into something close to wonder. "You're remarkable, Catherine Hartley. I don't think I've told you that enough. You've shown it in 100 different ways. That matters more than words." She squeezed his hand. "We have time now to build this partnership into whatever we want it to be. No more legal threats, no more uncertainty about the future. Just us and this land and the life we're creating. Together, Samuel confirmed. Together, Catherine agreed. They stood on the porch as stars emerged above the mountains. The valley spread before them in darkness and possibility. The journey that had brought them here, tragedy and deception, unexpected partnership and hard-won victory, had forged something neither had anticipated. Not the conventional life Catherine had sought, nor the solitary existence Samuel had known. Something new entirely. The homestead cabin stood solid behind them, its lamplight warm against the night. Inside waited the life they'd built together through crisis and determination. The future stretched ahead, unknown but no longer frightening. Catherine thought of James Hartley, the man whose death had set this all in motion. She couldn't regret the path that had led her here, though she still felt sorrow for the life he'd been denied. But perhaps, in some way, James had given her exactly what he'd promised in his letters: a fresh start in the West, a home built on honest work, a partnership with someone who valued her for who she truly was, just not in the way either of them had imagined. "I should check the irrigation channels before full dark," Samuel said finally, though he made no move to leave the porch. "And I need to prepare tomorrow's bread dough," Catherine replied, equally reluctant to break the peaceful moment. Neither moved. The work would wait. Right now, they simply stood together, two people who'd traveled separate paths to arrive at this shared destination, ready finally to build a future on their own terms. The mail-order groom had died on the trail, but his identical twin brother had married the bride to honor last words spoken in grief and hope. And from that unlikely beginning, something real and worthwhile had grown. Not the romance of storybooks, but the deeper satisfaction of genuine partnership, hard-earned respect, and a future built on honest foundation. As Catherine looked up at the stars wheeling overhead, she felt profound gratitude for the strange journey that had brought her here. She'd come west, seeking escape, and found instead a home. She'd expected a gentle husband, and received instead a strong partner. She'd feared being stranded in unfamiliar territory, and discovered instead that she possessed strengths she'd never known. The burned homestead that had never belonged to the man she'd agreed to marry had become hers in every way that mattered. The stranger who'd married her out of duty had become someone she genuinely cared for. The desperate gamble had transformed into solid ground beneath her feet. Tomorrow would bring the familiar rhythms of homestead life, the garden needing tending, the chickens requiring feed, the endless tasks that marked productive days. But tonight, Catherine stood beside her husband on the porch of their home, secure in the knowledge that they'd fought for this life and won, that the future stretching before them was theirs to shape together. And that was more than enough. It was everything. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.